In Search of Bolívar. William Ospina. Colombian writer, novelist, and critic born in Hervio, a municipality in the department of Tolima. In Search of Bolívar. His death was enough for all hatred to turn into veneration, all slander into prayers, all his deeds into legend. Dead, he was no longer a man but a symbol. Latin America hastened to turn that too fiery flesh into marble, and since then there has been no plaza that was not centered by his image, civil and pensive, or by his equestrian effigy, high on the Andes. At last, in marble, what always seemed about to happen in the flesh was resolved, that man and horse merge into a single thing. That existence, brief as a meteor, had illuminated the sky of his land and had filled it not only with shocks but also with prodigious dreams. Never in Hispanic America had such a dream been dreamed of. The golden story before the conquest cradled another type of dream. The naked and ritual clay lived in the myth, it had not emerged to individuality and history. Those kings who were the sun, those goddesses who were the earth, those poets of Tenochtitlan who sighed at the brevity of life, those draftsmen of Tikal and Palenque who drew with exquisite art the magical stels of the temples, lived in an almost inconceivable for us, they saw on earth another land and in the sky another sky. And the warriors of conquest, who devastated and profaned for 100 years a world much larger than Europe, did not understand dreams, only delusions and nightmares. Bolívar knew all that. He knew the story of the lakes of blood in which the Inca nobility and the Aztec nobility were drowned, he knew of the plains of bones lavished by swords and cannons and later dispersed by vultures. He knew about the black cloak with bat wings that the craftsman made for Atahualpa, and I wouldn't be surprised if he also knew about the stone spheres that ancient fathers buried in the forests of Central America, perhaps so that harmonious worlds would grow on their perfection. And he also knew of the sweetness of Africa, because one of his mothers, and perhaps the most endearing, had been that slave Hippolyta who gave him what perhaps his white Creole mother would not know how to give him, elemental human tenderness. Hippolyta, he said, is the only mother I have ever known. Like all South Americans, he was a mestizo, regardless of race. Hold Erlin had written shortly before, comparing the life of man with the life of rivers, that the greatest portion of what we are is due to birth, and to that ray of light that strikes the forehead of newborns. The power of that natal ray of light over our conscience is great. No one born in Colombia will cease to be Colombian, even if they spend their lives in Samarkand or Tananarive, and Bolívar himself wrote, the land of the native soil, before anything else, has molded our being with its substance. Our life is nothing other than the essence of our poor country by his origin. He belonged to the aristocracy, few Creoles had privileges like him. To see him act in his early days is to witness the gestation of a storm. In him were strength, indignation, rebellion. And in the world around him, the very germ of revolutions. His own father, a powerful and truly wealthy man, already felt the discomfort of living as a guest second class on the land he owned. He even wrote to Francisco de Miranda, offering his support for the cause of emancipation, at the first sign you give us, we are willing to follow you as our boss until the end, already spill the last drop of our blood in this great and honorable undertaking. He had too much to defend to let his discomfort turn into rebellion, or he wasn't alive enough to keep his promise. Because very few of those who have everything know how to feel what they lack. Those opulent Mantuans felt the heels of the metropolis on the back of their necks. The air that they lacked was the air of autonomy, which was beginning to have a name, which would soon only fit in the word independence, but the young Bolívar had to lose his parents to begin to feel the loneliness that begets feats. He had relatives in the vicinity of the crown, and at times the Bolívars could deceive themselves by saying that they belonged to the reigning nobility of the Indies. But at 16, in the courtyards of Madrid, in the vicinity of Godoy and the Queen, playing with the young prince as one more member of the court, Bolívar did not stop feeling alienated. There was a restlessness in him, an anxiety. That closeness would serve him, however, for something very different from puffing up. He knew that he did not belong entirely to the world of masters. Seeing the crown up close allowed him early to free himself from the superstitious submission to the power of royalty as it had been suffered in America for centuries. Even today certain privileged sectors of America practice the hand-kissing ceremony before the ornamental European aristocracy, what it would have been like 2 centuries ago. But the boy apparently escorted Queen Maria Luisa more than once on her nocturnal wanderings from her protector's house to the royal palace, and had enough of a run-in with the court to knock off the young man's hat in a teenage tantrum. Prince and see that the queen conceded to him in her anger. Those almost insignificant gestures take on some magnitude seen through the lens of distance and reinterpreted in the context of great historical dramas. Many American heroes could not even imagine that court that dominated them from the other side of the sea, and they had a certain psychological impossibility to assume that they could replace it on the stages of history. Bolívar freed himself early from the reverential fear, from the superstitious respect for that world, thanks to the chance of having frequented it at the age in which the own personal legend is gestated. He still had in the illusion of love the hope of living a life dedicated to himself and his fortune. Perhaps if Maria Theresa had not died of yellow fever in 1802, upon arrival in Caracas, in contact with that new land, Bolívar would have been another enlightened Mantuan, dedicated to his home and his haciendas. Nothing can be said about that, because destiny is always forged in the dark, and if sooner or later its secret pregnancies come to light, what does remain hidden from our gaze is what could have been, what could change forever the random. The death of his wife left him with all his love unsatisfied, with a useless passion filling his hours, a 19-year-old boy with all the time for himself and for his dreams. On that early grave he swore never to marry again, and he never betrayed his promise. Later he would confess that that duel convinced him that he had not been born to be happy, and this explains why, without ever giving up sensual pleasures, he dedicated his entire life to a different passion. He returned to Europe, realizing that what he had brought from there might not have been what he had come for. And in Europe the revelation of a destiny awaited him. But he no longer wanted to nest in Spain, where one day, with the romantic gesture of a brave and somewhat wild young man, he had resisted, sword in hand, through an alley in Madrid, a police inspection perhaps ordered by Godoy himself. He traveled to France, which had just gone through an ordeal of executions, through the storms of the National Assembly, through the historical madness of the decapitation of a monarchy, through the waves of parties succeeding one another in power, the waves becoming more and more acidic. Increasingly radical speeches, from Mirabeau to Desmoulins, from Danton to Marat, from Robespierre to Saint-Just. Those recent shadows, clamorous and tragic, hung over the young people of that time, attentive to history, eager for freedom and autonomy. The age of revolutions was dawning, the redemptive illusion that the human will could oppose the fatalities of history. Suddenly awakened by the French Revolution, young Americans wanted less to break with Europe than with the medieval burden that Spain had unloaded on America. Rousseau's dream required them to access modernity, and it is not surprising that the seed of freedom that the encyclopedists and enlightened philosophers were sowing in the soul of Europe immediately germinated in his mind. Bolívar was born with the revolution, grew up exposed to its fires, and like a good Spaniard from the periphery, he received without suspicion the influence of France, which central Spain always refused to accept. Perhaps no frontier was as firm and as harsh as the Pyrenees. Those mountains stood as a symbol of Spain's reluctance to be influenced by the neighboring nation. If that island, England, was linked to France by history, that other island, Spain, tried to forget that it was linked to France by nature. Through the Mediterranean came Phoenicia and Rome, the Jews and the Moors. Through the Mediterranean the doors were open for a long time, but France, hadn't she passed through century after century as a hostile force between Spain and Europe? Wasn't it a barrier in the heart of the empire when Spain was also Flanders and Germany and the kingdoms of Italy? That France that had not submitted when Spain held the scepter of the world now wanted to impose its philosophies and dreams on a nation proud of its antiquity and drunk with its symbols. Hispania had been one of the hearts of the Roman Empire, much more than Gaul. It was the cradle of power and spirit, the land of Trajan and Hadrian, the land of Lucan and Seneca. What could France show that was similar? After being faithful to the Manes of Rome, Spain also became faithful to the columns of Christ. While Iberia produced popes who defended orthodoxy, France was rather a hotbed of heretics, land of Cathars, cradle of anti-popes, fertile furrow for the schism. And when Spain decided to throw the Moors and Jews away, France kept its Jews and even allied itself with the Turks with curved swords against the power of Emperor Carlos V. Bolívar became something almost more undesirable than a South American, a Frenchified. A man in a box at the opera, who squandered in Paris a fortune amassed on the cocoa plantations of Caracas. But in France, too, he felt alienated, and this was to be aggravated when the rebellion, the very substance of his being, was tempered by a new monarchy. Now the sea of revolution was pooling under the three-cornered hat of absolute power. Napoleon himself was taking the diadem from the Pope's trembling hands to place it on his own temples under the rose window of Notre Dame, and Bolívar, who had received an invitation from the Spanish ambassador to attend the ceremony and had indignantly rejected it, he slipped in on his own, almost furtively, that December 2, 1804, and preferred to watch the scene from the crowd, not from the stands of official guests, as a sign of his discomfort. Republican blood burned in his veins. He saw in the emperor a traitor to the cause of freedom, although he did not stop shuddering seeing 1,000,000 people roar in the streets their admiration for that artillery lieutenant exalted for his merits to the status of king and demigod. Napoleon's moral integrity was in doubt, but his glory was unquestionable, and the boy from Caracas dreamed of a similar glory, although he preferred it conquered by a nobler cause. Deep down, he could even feel satisfied that Napoleon had given in to ambition. He had seized the title of Emperor of the Peoples, but perhaps he had left for someone else the more honorable title of Liberator of Nations. Bolívar went through the streets indignant. His blood was too hot for Rousseau and Diderot, for Voltaire and Spinoza. Perhaps also too full of Montesquieu, to be enthusiastic about the Caesarism of the Corsican. The time would come when he would impose the need to be a Caesarist and even to try to become Caesar. Life imposes certain claudication on all of us. However, his dream of giving freedom to Venezuela was still just an idea without much substance, a quixotic dream arising from the reading of enlightened philosophers, the dream of a Girondin from Rue Vivienne, of a salon revolutionary infected with French fashions. And that is why that meeting was so important, which must have taken place at the house of his beloved Fanny, the exquisite cousin who had comforted him in his widowhood. The unknown guest in the drawing room was a German baron in his mid-30s. From what his portraits and his books tell us, he could well outshine Bolívar in that room, because he had his elegance and a certain shine of predestination, but he surpassed him in all kinds of knowledge and was not inferior in the ability to express himself with conviction, and to subjugate the audience. And something more disconcerting, that German, 14 years older than him, knew more of Venezuela and Hispanic America than all the men of his time and, of course, infinitely more than Bolívar. It was Alejandro de Humboldt, and he had just returned from a 5-year trip that took him through Venezuela and Cuba, through New Granada, the province of Quito, and the viceroyalty of Peru. Then he had spent a whole year in Mexico, New Spain, and had just crossed North American territory and talked with the great men who had achieved independence from the United States. On the other side of the border, Guillermo de Humboldt received his brother's letters and shared them with his circle of enlightened friends. Goethe and Schiller followed the young man's routes on a map. His arrival in France was an event. The halls were opened for the traveler who had just discovered a world, and Bonaparte himself received him with a banquet to listen to the account of his explorations. This would also encourage the emperor's attempt to seize not only Spain but its populous mines on the other side of the Atlantic. But more definitive for history was Humboldt's encounter with Bolívar. The version of the equinoctial America that his lips proclaimed was a revelation for the young man. He thought he knew to which world he belonged, but Humboldt's eyes were the eyes of the Enlightenment and of Romanticism. Hölderlin would not have spoken with more veneration, with a more Spinozist and pantheistic sentiment, of those jungles teeming with life, of those rivers where the caimans seem to yawn butterflies, of those white trees of herons, of that profusion of branches shaken by happy tiny monkeys, of those lianas that are actually snakes, flowers that when they jump are poisonous, frogs, jaguars that are the crown of the voracious jungles. Bolivar himself said that Humboldt had seen in 3 years on the new continent more than the Spaniards had seen in 3 centuries. The German sage combined lucidity and passion. He had been able to be amazed by America while others had only coveted it, and he had just seen with almost frightened eyes a virgin world, an exuberant world, the miracle of life resolved in millions of ways. Unlikely flowers, boundless jungles, indescribable rivers, so that what Bolivar saw emerging before him was not the America mistreated by the Spaniards but the America unknown and wasted by the Americans themselves, the brave new world that it would be his destiny to liberate from the chains of colonialism and awaken to the challenge of a new age. If someone had suddenly made him drink the potions that the Indians of the plains prepare with sacred vines or with miraculous barks, perhaps he would not have hallucinated worlds more incredible than those that Humboldt discovered for him in erudite and rhythmic French, and Bolivar's imagination he must have felt unknown foliage under the music of Rousseau's dreams, he must have heard the anger of the peoples condemned to live their purgatory in paradise. He dreamed of emancipation but had not quite conceived it, and perhaps the most decisive moment of that meeting was when Humboldt, hearing him exclaim that the New World could only fulfill its destiny if it managed to shake off Spanish rule, assured the young man, who was still thoughtful after listening to him, that the American colonies were in a position to become independent. Later, Humboldt, with a resolute face and the look of one who has seen it all, added, without imagining what fire he was lighting with that look, "Your country is ripe for independence, but frankly I don't see who could be in charge of directing that company." We do not know what the precise words were that he pronounced, in that air filled with the fire of the revolution, with that ability to ask for the impossible that was the spirit of the times, but Humboldt's message remained stuck in his flesh like a thorn. Irremediable, and from that moment Bolivar only dreamed of the freedom of his land, and began to sense that he would be that man that Humboldt claimed and that he did not think he had found. Bonpland, Humboldt's traveling companion, who was present, then pronounced the sentence, "Revolutions themselves produce great men worthy of carrying them out." But perhaps none of these influences would have borne fruit if Bolivar had not met again in Paris, some say in Vienna, with his young teacher Simon Rodriguez, whom he had lost sight of since he fled into exile after an attempted rebellion in Caracas. The independence of America had first been gestated in the brains of a few men like him, nourished by encyclopedia and enlightenment, and nourished by the prose of Rousseau. There is a poem by Hölderlin, written in those years, which tries to give us an explanation of why that Genevan became the inspirer of an age of the world. The poet sees Rousseau as a man full of the spirit of prophecy, capable of reading in the signs of his time, indecipherable for others, everything that is going to happen. For the man of deep desires, one sign was enough, and the signs they have been since the dawn of time the language of the gods. His loneliness is nothing more than evidence that he already belongs to another time, to an age that his contemporaries cannot understand. For Hölderlin, Rousseau, sensing and announcing the upheavals of the revolution and the flashes of romanticism, understands at the first sign what will be accomplished, and is like the eagle that squawks across the sky, followed by storms. The image suits many great men of his time, including Hölderlin himself, Wordsworth and Novalis, Voltaire and Schiller, Miranda and Bolivar. Rodriguez was a few years older than his student, but it was enough for him to see the boy to understand the type of education he needed. He had Emilio in his hands and a new age on his horizon. He professed the religion of nature and the passion for new ideas, and it was he who found a channel for the boy's nervous, agitated and chaotic temperament, a destiny for that aimless energy that in the hands of his first tutors always seemed about to explode, that in the alleys of Madrid made him look like a madman, that led him to bite all the apples in his protector's garden, like someone possessed. Between dialogues and cavalcades, readings, and long days of physical exercise, he introduced Bolivar in the romantic mold of the good savage. He knew how to direct that torrent through the channel of liberal ideas, he discovered how to offer the calm of a destiny to that force of nature. But at the moment of their reunion, in the France of 1805, he found his disciple almost spoiled, wasting the wealth of his estates on idle amusements, without finding a clear direction for so much energy, wasting his talent on an ambiguous admiration for man, who, in his opinion, had betrayed the revolutionary cause. It is true that Bolívar rejected Napoleon and had dared to condemn him in salons and banquets in the presence of his supporters, but he lived drunk with Napoleonic dreams and dazzled by the evidence of his glory. Rodriguez took that clay that had not yet dried and subjected it once again to the rigor of his hands. It was necessary to break with that desperate and decadent life, tone the muscles, enliven the spirit. It was necessary to renew the ideals and recover the sense of duty towards the native land. The master had not lost his spell. Bolívar was once again a good disciple and accepted the challenge of a journey on foot across the Alps to Italy, many days of marching weighed down with bundles, to catch his breath in the breath of the mountains, to reconcile with Rousseau in the spirit of the solitary wanderer, along the same paths that Goethe traveled looking for the muses of Rome. The Alps on foot were a good preparation for the campaigns that would come later. The man who would cross the moors of the Andes in war, who following in the footsteps of Humboldt would climb Chimborazo, who would cross a continent much vaster and more difficult than Europe on horseback, would not cease to evoke in those gorges the avalanches on the Hannibal's armies, the thousand wars of all against all that have woven European history, the pilgrimages and mystical journeys that these landscapes suggest and animate. On the other side was Italy, one of the springs of Romanticism that took its name from Rome. On the other side also stretched the sea of legends. The poets and heroes of the North gave birth to their dreams and longings in that prophetic sea that had vainly threatened the boat of Julius Caesar and that had carried the disciples of Christ on its waves, eager to divulge from kingdom to kingdom that they had seen with his own eyes the newly resurrected friend rise into the air and be lost in the clouds. Goethe, Hölderlin, Keats, Shelley, Byron, they all wanted to go south to see the marble flower of the amphitheaters, to touch that foam that had thrown gods on the beach, to hear the nightingale sing that never dies, to drink a wine of great freedoms and to feed the dreams of the new age. Bolívar was part of that procession of enlightened people who searched in the Mediterranean clarity for an old light for their new dream, for the ideal of democracy, born beyond the abysses, in those regions where the sea and the light seemed to recommend equality. And the same three faces that had revealed his destiny to him in Paris were shown again in Italy, so that young Bolívar could examine them in a clearer light. In Milan, on the Montesquiaro plain, they once again saw the emperor up close, surrounded by the ostentatious cloud of his generals and as if isolated by the simplicity of his own dress, under an unadorned cape and unadorned hat. Bolívar once again felt the magnetism of that man whose personal destiny was confused with the drawings of history. All my attention was focused on Napoleon, he said later, and I only saw him among that crowd gathered there. My curiosity was insatiable. At that moment corresponds a fact at least striking. Because although Bolívar had seen Napoleon twice, this was the only time that Napoleon saw Bolívar, although of course he could not imagine who he was seeing. The emperor's throne had been placed on a rise in the plain, and Bolívar and his teacher stood close by, so that they could get a good look at him as he reviewed the Italian troops. But Napoleon saw everything, and as Bolívar later told Peru de Lacroix, several times he directed his lens towards the two figures, until Rodriguez himself, fearing that the emperor would take them for spies, advised his disciple to withdraw. Napoleon represented both the defeat and the victory of the revolution, the defeat of his dreams of equality, because after so many battles, so many cries for freedom, so many heads cut off to ensure the advent of the republic and the end of the monarchy, with its crown the nightmare of absolute power was reborn, but also victory, because after centuries of princes who reigned by divine right, when to be king one had to belong to ancient lineages and the curse of blood condemned commoners to being so forever, suddenly, thanks to the insurrection that made everyone equal in the face of fate, an almost foreign artillery lieutenant raised himself to the crown of France and was about to become the master of Europe, That could not have happened before the Great Rebellion. The talent of the warrior, the sagacity of the politician and the ambition of the adventurer replaced blood rights, and if a simple soldier could become emperor, now at least there was room for merit. We do not know what Simon Rodriguez said after the encounter with the usurper who made his blood churn, but we do know that in Rome, seized by that Italian spirit of grand scenery and theatrical gestures, on his knees and holding his master's hand, Bolívar swore in the Monte Sacro will not let its sword rest until it has liberated its land from Spanish domination. Bolívar was beginning to be Bolívar. And in those same days, by chance, if there is such a thing, Humboldt reappeared on the horizon. He had just come from doing I don't know what excavations on Vesuvius, and the meeting with the Venezuelan boy he had met in a salon in Paris was the occasion for long cavalcades around Rome, for new and exalted conversations that novelists would one day reinvent. Another fact that is a symbol of Bolívar's arrogance, and also of the strength of his character, is worth remembering from that trip through Italy, the audience with Pope Pius VII, the same one who had gone in vain to crown Napoleon. Bolívar, accompanied by the Spanish ambassador, refused to do what everyone else did, kneel to kiss the cross traced on the Pope's sandal. We can imagine the ambassador's discomfort in the tension of that moment. It seems that the Pope, understanding the situation, extended his ring so that the young man from Caracas could kiss it. And when leaving, in the face of the diplomat's reproaches, Bolívar limited himself to declaring that the Pope should have very little appreciation for the symbol of Christianity if he wore it that way on his shoes. Thus sounded the hour of return. The 19-year-old boy who had left was not the 23-year-old who returned to Caracas in February 1807. Nor was the country the same one he had left. In reality, he had not seen his country since the previous century, because during the brief visit in 1802 he barely had eyes for his wife and for that unexpected grave that left him alone with his questions and his dreams. The land that spread out before him was full of revolutionary ferments. Meanwhile, another man had reached his same conclusions, and had been dreaming of the freedom of Venezuela for more than 20 years, it was Francisco de Miranda. If Bolívar was shown his way by an emperor, a scholar, and a revolutionary teacher, Miranda's destiny had led him to be part of the War of Independence of the United States, a passionate and leading part of the French Revolution, and an interlocutor of monarchs and generals. Those convictions to which Bolívar arrived through his personal experience and his intellectual formation were obtained by Miranda from the landscape of the time and from the great political storms in which he was involved from the age of 25. This would also mark the difference between his two companies. Miranda always believed that the freedom of his land would be the result of international alliances, of agreements between great powers and the result of complex political tensions. Bolívar understood that the internal struggle of the countries and the personality of its leaders would be essential in that process. Perhaps he was also beginning to be aware that freedom could only be a continental conquest. Miranda dreamed of a country, and called it Colombia, to correct what he considered a historical injustice, that the lands discovered by him had not been given the name of Columbus, and designed for that country a flag with the three primary colors of the iris, yellow, blue and red. That country would encompass the southern continent and, according to his dreams, was to be ruled by a hereditary monarch whose title would be the Inca. Miranda then spent his life from court to court, from risk to risk and from battle to battle, vainly attempting powerful alliances between his country and the enemy powers of Spain. But those enmities changed with the breath of events. Yesterday's rivals woke up united by new political lurches, and the American colonies always came out losers both in disputes and in reconciliations. We could say that Miranda grew old before the historic opportunity of independence had been given. Born in 1750, he was almost 60 years old when Napoleon invaded Spain, creating the power vacuum that American Creoles finally took advantage of to feel for the first time masters of their destiny. From the battles of Virginia to the barricades of Paris, from the debates of the French National Assembly to the halls of the British Parliament, from the Haydn concerts in Vienna to the mosques of Constantinople, from the bed of Catherine of Russia to the fjords of Norway, Miranda had tried everywhere to move the gears of great politics to make his Colombian Venezuela free, but only at the age of 56, in an already desperate act of heroism, did he try to confront, with warships and only 180 armed men, the Spanish power on the Venezuelan coast, and was repulsed and defeated. That same year he tried for the second time. For the second time he waved the flag of the three colors on the coast of his beloved land, but tragically no one heeded his call. The people of the country did not quite know who he was. His cause, admirable and brilliant, was only in his mind, it had not reached the hearts of his fellow citizens. How ironic are the paths of history. In that year of 1807, the Spanish power could have thought that with the defeat of Miranda the danger of losing its dominions in America had been averted. It did not know, in that moment of triumph, that the troops French women who were beginning to enter the peninsula would soon take possession of everything, and he could not imagine that a boy who was returning to his homeland after years of absence would soon become more dangerous than Miranda, and would become the architect of a great continental rebellion. Although Bolívar returned to Venezuela full of forebodings, he did not know what doors history was going to open in his path. 3 centuries the Spanish domination had lasted here. And if the first was a massacre and robbery, the next 2 were recounted in solemn rosaries and setting the scene with rooster masses for the continuous looting of resources. The northern treasure remained in the north. El Dorado, on the other hand, crossed the ocean in the tireless galleons of the House of Austria, drifted towards the ringed hands of German and Genoese bankers, was exchanged for the manufactures of the industry's predecessors. The British Crown was less interested in the riches of its own colonies than in the booty of Spanish galleons, so the epic, Under the Wing of the Throne, of English pirates pillaging ports and convoys from Tierra Firme was the Baroque version of an old story, the story of the thief who robs the thief. And so the fight for the freedom of America was for the English a juicy opportunity for new business. After so much blood, the bond that kept the colonies tied to Spanish power was less force than custom. Not even those who suffered from domination could conceive of a life without it, and only the entry of that disproportionate storm that was upsetting the physical and mental order of Europe, Napoleon, produced the mental ruptures necessary for a world to wake up from the lethargy of that domination. 3 centuries and some came to think that it was possible to create nations and establish republics on the still soft mud of the New World. Advancing through Austria, through Prussia, through Russia, in defiance of England, Napoleon wanted to make the whole of Europe an extension of France, and it was not long before he was heard to declare that France would be the world. The new epoch born of the revolution had tried to reorder everything, the measurements of space and time, the nations, the names of the months, the principles on which the institutions rested and the gods under which blood flowed and languages grew. Before the force of modernity, the Iberian world would also fall. In November 1807, Napoleon advanced on Portugal. The House of Braganza had to be abandoned to the mercy of the sea. An English ship allowed the Emperor of Portugal to establish his throne in the jungles of the Brazilian Atlantic coast, and that was decisive for the fate of Brazil. For a brief time the body and soul of the empire coincided on American soil. Today there is no party or Brazilian company that does not owe something to that historic accident. Another was the fate of Spain, and its kings became hostages of the new master of the world. It is said that when he was just a cadet, Napoleon had his brother José, barely 8 years old, under his custody in Paris, subjected to an almost military regime. One day the little boy was slow to get up and, faced with his older brother's reproach, he told him, "It's just that I had a very beautiful dream. I dreamed that I was king." "That you were a king?" said Napoleon indignantly. "Then what was I?" "Emperor." The anecdote, although it must be false, well illustrates the spirit of that man who would exalt his brothers as kings, and it was because of that spirit that José Bonaparte ended up becoming the monarch of Spain. Napoleon's plan was to also seize the territories of America, but the colonies were beginning to be fed up with colonial domination, and when the rumor reached them that their king was a prisoner of the French, they chose to assume their majority and declare, in a bloodless way, Independence throughout the continent. The first movement was carried out more by the cities than by still undefined countries. Caracas declared its independence on April 19, 1810, and Bolívar, whose house was the seat of many conspiracies, should have been one of the signatories of the act, but the initiative had been of the moderate rebels, and Bolívar was seen as a radical nationalist. That day he was at his farm, under surveillance, and the events were consummated in his absence. The various positions of the new administration were filled, and if he was appointed ambassador to London, with the mission of having the emancipated territory recognized by the English government, perhaps it was because he himself promised to cover the costs of the trip. But life is like art, nobody knows what they are looking for until they find it. We now know that, although this was his intention, Bolívar did not go to England to gain recognition from the British government, but to meet with Francisco de Miranda and start one of the brightest and most dramatic moments of American independence. Brilliant, because the relationship between the two Venezuelans could not be more romantic. A 60-year-old thinker, military man, and politician, veteran of all wars, friend of all the great men of his time, obsessed with independence and accustomed to the great world. And a rich young dreamer, more enlightened in ideas than in experience, whose burning impatience was consumed to take action. Those days in London they were seen everywhere, in restaurants, parks and theaters, chatting in the car-filled avenues, and the London press took care of them. They saw the same streets through which Thomas de Quincey wandered searching in vain for his lost friend, for which a decade later little Charles Dickens would be almost asleep going from his father's prison to the shoe polish factory where he worked, through which poor 15-year-old John Keats had to cross, also orphaned of his father and mother, that boy who said that the Creator must first create himself, and for whom the same love was resolved in anxiety and misery. By nature and the same thirst for action that would make Bolívar one of the names in the world. And it was not long before the young Venezuelan ambassador found himself in the halls of London with a resentful and incendiary aristocrat, full of liberal dreams, devilish seducer and forgotten hero, who 12 years later would be the first admirer of Bolívar in Europe, the poet George Gordon Byron, whose destiny later was the always frustrated obsession to join the armies of the Orinoco in the fight for the freedom of Colombia, but in that same year of 1810, Byron had just left the streets of London where Bolívar arrived, to embark on his ritual pilgrimage through Europe, which took him from the green hills of Sintra in Portugal, through Spain, Italy, and Greece, to the blue waters of the Bosphorus, where he became the first European to swim across from Europe to Asia. Bolívar's admiration for Miranda had much of that romantic pathos. But underneath that admiration, something tragic began to unfold, the relationship with the father he never had, the gradual discovery that this father rivaled his son, disputed his right to have his own criteria, maintained a conception of politics and the struggle revolutionary that was nothing like the one Bolívar saw being born in contact with American reality. But in the first meeting everything was light and trust. Bolívar convinced him to return to Venezuela with him and set himself up as one of the leaders of the revolution. Perhaps Miranda had lived too long in Europe and was no longer sure which world was hers. He dreamed of building European nations in America, which was perhaps possible. I wanted to build them in the European way, which was already more difficult. Bolívar would spend the rest of his life discovering in amazement what was in America, but he noticed some things from the beginning, not only the curious diversity of the countries, but also their radical difference with Europe. Anyone who did not know that this land is another world, or, as our Fernando González would say, another part, could not liberate America. The fact that Europe's original contact with America was not an encounter but a clash, the fact that the Atlantic contract had been for 3 centuries an easement contract, the fact that the native of America was radically different from the European man, much more akin to the Asian and in particular to the Indian, which explains why, intuitively, the Europeans gave him that name, the fact that for 3 centuries slavery had been acclimatized here, and there had been such a diversity of human mixtures, all subject to the stratification of the metropolis, the fact that nature remained unquestioned and far from being deciphered, Each one of these events had a decisive influence on the revolutionary process that those two men unleashed in the vicinity of the Caribbean, and that Bolívar later spread throughout the continent with an ardor and obstinacy that did not seem human. Miranda was made to measure for revolutionary storms, assembly debates, imperial legions, and parliamentary polemics. Bolívar was the son of the ruling aristocracy in the Indies, but there was also in him a silent plainsman too close to the land, the adopted son of slaves, a sensual temperament, a seducer, a dancer, a wild Caribbean, an original thinker who did not give up to imitate anyone, neither organized England nor thoughtful France, who knew that their America was going to be capable of offering novelties to the dream of civilization, things still inconceivable, still unthinkable, but that they would not be able to conceive and think of them if she allowed herself to be by herself, to look at history through her own eyes, to stop feeling like a second guess at the world's banquet. The dream of democracy, the dream of the Republic, were just beginning. If in Europe it was difficult to pave the way for the ideal of freedom, equality, and fraternity, in Europe, where there were no profaned indigenous races or legions of slaves dispossessed of any notion of rights, where mestizages were so old that they were already perceived as nationalities homogeneous, how much more difficult it was to conceive democracies of Spaniards and Creoles, Indians and blacks, mestizos and mulattoes, and cuarterones and zambos. How to build republics where diversity does not give rise to an endless anarchy, where races and customs do not encourage an insatiable war. How to found institutions capable not only of containing that plurality but of enlarging it, turning those plural individuals into solidary citizens. Bolívar never resolved that dilemma, because that would be the task of generations, and it is still the task of our countries, but he did the most difficult thing, take the first impossible step into the unknown. His feat can only be described with those vertiginous lines of Baudelaire, written long after that, heaven, hell, what does it matter? Deep into the unknown to find the new. Politics tried to turn him into a statue, to stop him in marble, but his legend spread through history, art, and literature. Entire libraries were filled with their deeds and with the reflection on their deeds. His work and his life deserved all analysis, were subjected like few others to the test of time, and he is still debated as if he were alive, as if he were about to make each of his decisions. Few human beings have become such a benchmark for all policies and the basis of all doctrines, for few have the most opposing factions disputed in such a way. But what gave him that prestige, and that air of legend that borders on the supernatural, if not the belated surprise of some nations discovering that that man had almost always been right? At this point, whoever studies Bolívar always runs the risk of idealizing him. His actions were so many and so decisive, his determination so lavish in consequences, and the geographical and historical setting in which his exploits were accomplished so difficult, that it is not only it is not possible to find justification for many of his actions, but the whole confronts us with the excessive picture of an ineluctable will and a surprising reserve of energy. For his contemporaries, to witness the spectacle of his life was to be confronted with an often inexplicable chain of events and decisions. It was easy, as always, to misread his intentions. But most human beings do not have history as a witness and judge of our actions. The final judgment is made in private and does not have the world as a witness. Bolívar was a man snatched by the genius or the demon of history, and only history could give the verdict. What a whirlwind of events! The young man who refuses to kiss the cross on the Pope's sandal and who smiles at the exit saying that if that prelate wears the sign of his faith on his shoes it is because he surely does not appreciate it very much. The opulent boy who summons a legion of influential political and military figures, followers of Napoleon, to a banquet in Paris to unleash on them a fierce libertarian speech against the usurper, and who loses the friendship of almost all of them in one day, the man who advances through the crowd through that Paris of hunchbacked alleys in 1804 with his soul torn between hatred for the emperor and delirious admiration for the popular hero, the man who throws a priest from his tribune in a square in ruins, before the desperation of the multitude, the day of the earthquake in Caracas, because he cannot admit that someone is attributing the catastrophes of nature to the revolution, are less disconcerting than the one that would be Bolívar later. You have to see him doing somersaults on a horse before a group of plainsmen, and thereby arousing the indignation of the experienced Miranda, who felt that these indisciplines would never allow him to form a competent army. You have to see him aiming his pistol at dawn at the face of that forerunner of independence, who had also been his great friend and inspirer, and you have to see him leaving that father in the hands of the Spanish enemies, who would give him opprobrium and death. You have to see him accepting a saving passport from the same hands that have imprisoned Miranda. You have to see him in Barrancas, next to the Magdalena, after the catastrophe and exile, disobeying the orders of his boss, Captain Pierre Labatut, and taking the troops to Tenerife and Mompox, and later in Cúcuta giving them the order to advance towards Venezuela, without waiting for the authorization of their new Granadan bosses. You have to see him demanding Moreno, who had rescued half of Venezuela, to submit to his orders and renounce governing his Eastern Republic. You have to see him threatening Santander that he would sentence him to death, the very day they met. You have to see him on another occasion thinking of laying siege to Cartagena, which was governed by patriots. You have to see hundreds of his actions, inexplicable to those who witnessed them, to think that perhaps that man was crazy. But the one who studies runs the risk of feeling that there was a method in his madness, that even in the moments when it seemed most delirious the decision he made was the best one, as far as possible, and the most convenient, not for himself, but for your country. And if one thinks that the country he thought of did not yet exist, that the great nation he was fighting for does not really exist yet, 200 years later, one justifies the vertigo. One sometimes ends up thinking that Neruda is correct when he says that in this world Bolívar is on earth, in water and in the air, that Bolívar is one of the names of the continent. The enigmas that his life poses have not yet been resolved by his biographers. They have managed to trace the events with dedication, sometimes with admiration, often in great detail. And they don't all write the same book, they complement each other well, they help each other. Macer is more thorough and academic, John Lynch is more synthetic and persuasive. Macer tells us that to attend to personal matters Bolívar arrived late to a battle, like Marco Antonio, but it is Indalecio Livano who tells us what her name was. They tell us everything in such detail, and from such different perspectives, that we feel close to understanding the reason for the unreasons of this amazing man. We ended up understanding that on that morning in the barracks, when Miranda looked out and saw an officer jumping from side to side of the horse, doing somersaults like a horseman before the rustic plainsman, when he approached to punish him for his indiscipline before discovering to his indignation that he was Bolívar himself who was offering that show, it was not Miranda who was right. The veteran officer, hero of 3 revolutions and experienced leader of large armies, dreamed of forming armies of Prussian discipline in America, regiments that throw themselves into the oven like wax figures at the sound of a single voice, like the ones he was melting at that hour. Napoleon in the braziers of Europe. But Bolívar knew that such armies could not be amassed with the clay of this America, that his first duty was to be accepted by those rude peons who knew everything about horse and lance, and who would never respect a chief who was not able to do everything they did. Miranda had spent his life believing that the freedom of his America would come from political agreements. Bolívar already felt that this freedom would only be achieved by the struggle of the peoples, and that his protagonists would not be ministers and diplomats but those mestizos and those zambos of the Morichal and from the swamp that seemed to barely emerge from the earth as Adamic creatures, without civil customs, who would have to learn in the struggle what a human being deserves and, above all, what a citizen deserves. Miranda dreamed of the freedom of America, but her soul was forever in Europe. And we also ended up discovering that, months later, when, without a doubt with the best intentions, Miranda signed the armistice with the Spanish, he was really abandoning a fight that already involved millions of beings, and that, because of this abandonment, the dominators would not only perpetuate their power but would do so in an increasingly humiliating way. Yes, Bolívar could have allowed him to embark and go into exile, but for that he would have to be the head of something, and at that moment he was nothing more than a defeated commander who punished at the last moment what he considered treason. He himself was not sure of his head and had no future. There was only his indignation at work, the feeling that his teacher and inspirer had shown himself capable, in a fit of dignity or exasperation, of throwing overboard the struggle of everything. A town. Miranda had been appointed chief, but apparently he believed himself to be the master of the revolution. He thought he could hand her over without even consulting his men. Rather, it must be said that at that moment, one of the most terrible of his life, plunged into despair at having lost the fort of Porto Cabello and torn by the urgency of recovering the lost ground, Bolívar, who has a reputation as an impulsive man and sometimes angry, he could have shot the head of the chief who was abandoning the fight, and rather had the restraint of demanding that he be put on trial, hoping, yes, that he would be shot. The Spaniards did not give him time to fulfill this legal right. In confused circumstances they seized Miranda, and by reducing him to prison, they showed how clumsily he had been mistaken in trusting them. 2 weeks later, while Miranda began his final, tragic, and somber captivity, Bolívar, through the intercession of his friend the Spaniard Iturbe, was about to receive a passport from Monteverde that would allow him to leave the country and survive the shipwreck of the First Republic, and it was at that moment when the Spaniard said that the passport was granted to him for services rendered to the King of Spain, when he handed them over to the leader of the revolution. Bolívar felt a chill. Although it was the least convenient for him, he raised his voice to say, "I did not arrest Miranda to render a service to the king, but to punish him for having betrayed his country." Everything was said. The official, who was already holding out his passport, stopped him again, surely thinking that this man should rather be taken to accompany the other in prison. Then the star that would save Bolívar so many times throughout a life of incessant danger, the same star that kept him in Jamaica in an uninhabited house while nearby a supplier for his troops was assassinated in his hammock, the same star that received him in Cartagena in 1812, when he was nobody, like Ulysses, the same one that gave birth to him in Mompox, and took him in 2 weeks to double his troop, the same one that gave him ships and supplies in Haiti when he was an exile filled only with delusions, the same one that madly proposed to him, now with the plane free, to cross the impassable mountain range and deal an unexpected blow to the Spaniards in Boyaca, the same one that lit up his dialogue behind closed doors with the chief of the armies of the South in Guayaquil, the same one that threw in its path a crown of flowers or laurel leaves from a balcony in Quito, the same one that with the face of love opened the window to the cold of September so that he could escape the daggers of his friends. At that moment he illuminated Iturbe to tell General Monteverde, "Don't pay attention to this skull, and give him the passport so he can leave at once." He wasn't just defeated. That passport was the symbol of the failure of a nation, but also of the failure of a friendship and of a destiny. Behind there were only ruins. The earthquake of 1812 seemed to fill with its devastation the entire horizon of that time. But from now on we will find Bolívar's strange ability to reinvent himself. And it is important to see that the first instrument of this reconstruction was always writing. The text that he wrote to think about the experience of the First Republic, to examine the errors and formulate the new tasks must have been conceived in Curaçao, but later, for political reasons, Bolívar would give it the name of Cartagena Manifesto. In his fiery language, the politician was being born who was examining all the facts and drawing the guidelines for a new phase of the war. The man who appears in that proclamation is already cured of illusions. He is a distrustful and somewhat implacable warrior. Not the Spaniards but our own disunity has brought us back into slavery. A strong government could have changed everything. It could even have overcome the moral confusion that followed the earthquake. With it, Venezuela would have been free today. He did not forget that Miranda dreamed of a country but backed away from its challenges and refused to learn from it. Now Bolívar knew that the American war, more than a war only against the Spaniards, was a war against the lack of faith of the Americans themselves, against their limited ambitions, against the comfort of those who want freedom but not sacrifices, against the apathy of people lost in great desolate landscapes. It was not for nothing that he admired Voltaire so much, A company like the one that Bolívar foresaw only fits in phrases like the one that Voltaire coined for the men of his time: they needed miracles, they did them. And it was at the same time a fight with equinoctial nature. His adversaries would also be the storms and the swamps, the moors and the burning plains, the tigers, the alligators, the shadows that snake over the dead leaves. Miranda was more inclined to defend positions than to attack and obtain new ones, and with that she had not even managed to keep what she was given. The policy of the First Republic had been marked by a lack of audacity, by a kind of paralysis, as if instead of seizing a country, everyone was waiting for it to be courteously ceded to them. What the Cartagena Manifesto now seeks is a change of attitude and rhythm. That words and deeds go together, marching in the same direction, that they reflect and feed each other, that the thinker is no longer in conflict with the man of action. But the most serious learning of that time is not so much in the words as in the spirit of that manifesto, in the hardness of its rhythm and in the ferocity of its proposals. Bolívar has learned suddenly that he is not engaged in an idealistic exercise but in a war, with all the brutality, the mud, the blood, the pain, and the cruelty that that word contains. Venezuela destroyed, Bolívar looked for the patriots of New Granada, who had declared independence, also bloodlessly, in the same year of 1810, when the cry of freedom shook all the provinces equally. Nobody could imagine that this man who had come fleeing from the Furies, successively suffering an earthquake, a betrayal, a defeat and an exile, came wrapped in the mantle of iris, was already measuring in his flight the magnitude of the homeland that it would be necessary for him to invent. The first thing his new bosses demanded of him was already impossible: remain motionless. But that purpose of immobilizing him was only achieved by the men when they stopped him in marble. They gave him a small troop in barrancas, but they forbade him to move. Bolívar, always ready to listen to the orders of his bosses, it seems that he will now only obey the orders of reality. The Magdalena River was in the hands of the Spanish. Freeing the central artery of the territory from royalist troops could be a good help. The patriotic governments would later decide whether they would appreciate it or not. But New Granada lived at that time in that state of political sleepwalking that historians called the foolish homeland. The provinces, intoxicated by the illusion of being free and owners of a small territorial power, fought each other with incestuous fury. Antonio Nariño, the great man from New Granada, lucid, cultivated and brave, did not even manage to get the neighboring province of Tunja to ally with Santa Fe. When he sent his emissaries to invite them to join, Tunja responded with hostile swords and cannons. The young and anguished Antonio Ricaurte, commander of the Nariño troops, deserted in the Battle of Ventaquemada, overwhelmed by the fear of killing his brother and his relatives, who came on the opposite side, and left his army beheaded on the battlefield. Fog under the blind bullets of the enemy. After defending his city as best he could, in the shadow of the hills, in battles in which even the vegetable vendors of San Victorino fought, and where his own daughters fired cannons, Nariño later managed to form an army from the provinces, but with links so weak that, as he advanced with them towards the south, to meet the Spaniards, he was losing soldiers night after night, through Ibagué, through Cartago, through Cali, through Popayan, through the extreme rigor of the Pacha Cañon, from in such an absurd and delusional manner that the hero arrived in Pasto, where the enemy fort was located, with just 2 men, and the only thing he could do was surrender to the troops he intended to destroy. And yet he did it with such reckless and theatrical gestures that even today that generous land, which had been his enemy, bears his name. And that was New Granada, the conflictive and complex land to which Bolívar arrived seeking help in defeat, a land that he could no longer part with, the land that would inherit the name of his Colombia, where some of his campaigns were carried out. Where he encountered perhaps his greatest obstacles, the land that multiplied his forces, the land where glory, betrayal, and death were waiting for him. At 30 years old, Simon Bolívar has too much energy, too much influence over those boys on the banks of the Magdalena to remain motionless watching the eternal yawn of the alligators. The boats call it. In 4 weeks of agile movements along the river, of surprise assaults on the banks, of advances through cane fields and living jungles, he leaves the river free of enemies and multiplies his own troops by 3. If obedience had paralyzed him in Porto Cabello a few months ago, now insubordination will put him back at the gates of his country. Nothing will serve us better to understand what this man was like than that vertiginous campaign from 1812 to 1813. Seeing him arrive in Curaçao defeated but thinking day by day how to start over, seeing him arrive in Cartagena with only a manifest in his hands that looks more like a letter from a castaway, seeing him there convince President Manuel Rodriguez Torres of his revolutionary dream, while voices with a French accent are heard that consider him rather a deserter and even demand that he be shot, see him take command of 200 men in the village of Barrancas, and receive the order to remain there without moving. He would never forget the weapons they gave him, 3 pistols, 16 rusty rifles, 32 spears, 25 machetes, and some 30 knives. And to think that from that ridiculous arsenal the Second Venezuelan Republic was born. 17 years later, going down the river on the final journey, Bolívar would still enumerate those old pieces of iron to Peru de la Croix, crossing before the same scenes of that mythical dawn. To see him go against the orders of his hostile commander Labatut, who had arrived in America with Miranda and was now unfairly charging him for the La Guaira disaster, to see Bolívar, defying the gallows, advancing on clumsy rafts along muddy shores here and deep in the jungle there, barely paddling against the current and praying in vain to the god of the wind. To see him attack the enemy in Tenerife with one part of the troops, while the other repels the Caymans. To see him ascend stealthily towards Mompox between dense guajules without sensing that, suddenly, the telltale bustle of the parrots would unleash the Spanish cannon fire against his troops. See him triumph in 2 rounds, chasing terrified royalists through the jungle and capturing many. It seems that in the end the number of prisoners was greater than that of the captors. And in the midst of the war scenes to see Bolívar in Tenerife surrendered in the embrace of the beautiful and tender little French girl Anita Lenoit. Lacroix's Peru is only mentioned in passing, looking longingly at the banks of the Magdalena. But Indalecio Livano has managed to reconstruct the story, which does not take place in Tenerife but in the blurred village of Salamina, where a French merchant had settled in a small house in the town, which stood out among the others for having a flowered garden. In the town canteen, where they entered looking for information about the royalist troops they planned to attack, Bolívar heard from a beautiful girl who spoke in a strange language. Later he was walking among the huts, when there, in the only house with a garden in the village, that 17-year-old blonde girl appeared before his eyes. Even in the most lost places, Bolívar knew how to find beauty. He greeted her in French, and soon they were talking about Paris, about the corners and parks of that city that he knew well. It must have seemed incredible to the girl to suddenly find, next to the wild rivers of the Amérique du Sud, that eloquent warrior who reinvented in her language the gardens with marble, the palaces and the fountains of those lost neighborhoods. They were not together for more than 3 days, around Christmas 1812, but, urged by the battles that awaited and by the imminence of separation, that meeting in French was intense and passionate, and strongly marked their lives, although Bolívar had in the war a better refuge for separation than that lonely girl, lost in a village under the great river forests. That garden was opened for Bolívar in the midst of his intrepid campaign for the liberation of the Magdalena. Anita would look for him later, in Tenerife, determined to go to war with him, and he, who had nothing to offer her, in the midst of his obstinacy to return to Venezuela to refound the Republic, found no other way to dissuade her from this madness than the lying promise to return one day to marry her. Still in Salamina, it is said that years later, when he was already descending towards death, Bolívar asked in vain for her, and that Anita, already a 34-year-old woman, when she found out, sailed downriver in pursuit of the procession and arrived in Santa Marta when just a few hours ago General Bolívar had died. Because always, from the beginning, after the battles will come the dances, the loves. His life is hanging on a rose, and it is enough to remember a subsequent episode, while the streets were stunned by the noise of the warriors who had just entered Mompox, the beautiful and endearing city of the Magdalena River, Bolívar, who was dozing in a hallway, almost naked on the hammock, he suddenly felt as if a mountain cat was rubbing its back against his body. And there he was visited by a vision that would haunt him for so many years of war, the beautiful mulatto girl, with slanted brown eyes, whose dark skin had the exciting scent of the jungle. She looked at me coquettishly, winking at me to follow her, an act I did flying, and entering the room she got ready in her best form, and produced in me such motivation that my body seemed to explode with my palpitations. It will be the sick and almost dying Bolívar of the descent down the Magdalena who remembers those roses on the road. It was exuberant, warm, all wet, the Mompesina. She made me the delights of Eros on a palatial afternoon and for 2 more days. Her name was Rebecca, and I never knew her surnames, or where she came from, or where she went, nor was there any time to ask why she had given herself to me, or why she had questioned me out of love, or something similar. And in the memory is the surrounding atmosphere, an afternoon when Mompox seemed like a hive of people, because of the fair, with a radiant summer hot Sunday. And you have to see him return to the road, through El Banco, Chiragana, Tamalamaki, reach Ocana, with the troop frantic for the triumphs, and already well supplied with weapons, supplies, ammunition, and food, climb the mountain range towards the Moors, cross in war through the old lands of Ursua, through the moors of Pamplona and through the radiant forests of Chinacota and Bacalema, where centuries ago an arrow pierced the throat of the German adventurer Ambrosio Alfinger. This is not just any campaign, it is not simply the first great campaign, it is the applied school of war, where Bolívar is going to discover a good part of his talents, to invent a good part of his resources. Along this path appeared the good consequences of the original education of Simon Rodriguez, the art of deprivation, of austerity, of stoicism. The familiarity with nature, the skill to cross rivers, the resistance to climb the mountains. He has to report to Colonel Castillo, but he takes so many initiatives in such a short time that one feels like wings are unfolding, that a hidden force is released. Where Castillo hesitates, for fear of the Saroche of the heights, where Castillo cracks, Bolívar jumps and flies. Attack, do it with surprise, almost suicide, he says. He learned many things that would later put his name in history, even to do what should not be done, what cannot be done. To decipher the weaknesses of the enemy with eagle eyes, to fight with force, and as he himself said, without fatigue, without mercy, they have not had it with us. Nothing was missing in that initial campaign. The march, he says, was an incessant gymnastics where the arms and hands worked more than the feet or the legs. With the risk of being bitten by tarantulas, whose bite can kill a horse, clouds of mosquitoes, poisonous snakes. At night, the huge vampires of the jungle, as opposed to the bats of the coast. Innumerable and ferocious insects attracted by the fires, lit to scare away the jaguars and panthers. Much has changed in our world since then, but 2 centuries ago, nature was the same as the one crossed by the Spanish conquerors 5 years ago. And these were the roads where, behind the evil caravan of Alfinger, who beheaded the sick Indians so as not to have to open their chained necklaces, ran the plague of tigers, fattened by the corpses. To see him arrive in Cúcuta and stop only for a moment on the threshold of Venezuela, just to send messages to his bosses asking them to allow him to take advantage of those troops that he himself has invented in a daring campaign, and run to rescue. Desire to make the Spanish leader feel that by granting him that passport he had not allowed the escape of a man but the rebirth of a revolution. That passport that would later be slandered by Hippesley and defamed by Marx, that passport suspected of guilt and won by Bolívar only for the privilege of being a rich Creole, had to be justified before history, redeemed from all shadows, washed away from all suspicion of infamy, and when the chiefs of Cartagena, after 1,000 hesitations and debates, gave him the authorization to advance towards the neighboring provinces to the east, Bolívar wrote them exultantly, "I await your next reply." In Trujillo, he was already determined to advance towards Caracas, he himself could not prevent it. Glory called him less than pride. They called him with the same force his fidelity to his native soil and the need to avenge the loss of the fort of Porto Cabello, which still tormented him in his dreams, to erase from his soul the sinister days of La Guaira, the disgraceful shipwreck of the First Republic. They were 9 months from the beginning of the campaign, they were 1,200 kilometers through mountainous, forested regions, without roads, 6 battles fought, 6 battles won. Bolívar did not advance only as a warrior defeating the Spaniards in his path, but as a politician conquering the hearts of his people, as a tribune disseminating proclamations, as an administrator organizing the territory. It almost seems incredible to us that the man who entered Caracas under showers of flowers, to the applause of the crowd, was the same one who a year before had gone into exile, spiritually undone, ruined and aimless. Bolívar is already Bolívar, but although we see him in the fullness of his strength, and triumphant, the road to his statue will still be long. In his first 20 years, politics and war hardly existed, except as paragraphs of his books or fragments of his conversation. And from the moment that Napoleon set himself up as his example for so many things, for another 8 years there were more trips, debates, and conspiracies in Bolívar's life than warlike deeds. He had begun his political career more as a diplomat than as a soldier, and when the war finally appointed him a place, the young man was incensed at Miranda for having appointed him commander of the Porto Cabello fort, because he felt that the arrogant chief was separating him from the only where he wanted to be, the battlefront. It was especially painful that his first great responsibility had ended in catastrophe. And if it is true, as Borges wants, that the ancient food of heroes is humiliation, danger, and defeat, Bolívar started his career well. As soon as the war started, he had already suffered humiliation, faced danger, regretted defeat. That victorious advance from Mompox into the heart of Venezuela, which history called the Admirable Campaign, was his brief compensation for that frustrating start. Marx would reproach him for not having attacked Porto Cabello, the enemy's stronghold, and for having preferred to advance towards Caracas in search of the honeys of triumph, to bow his head before the garlands offered him by maidens dressed in white, but Macer soberly absolves him. Nothing more human, after such adversity and such a meritorious campaign, than to go and drink a little glory. Besides, he wasn't going to any city to look for her, it was his own homeland. He has had crazy luck, although in men like Bolívar it is difficult to differentiate what is due to luck, what is due to talent, what is due to the laws of history. In this campaign he has been favored first by his social position, then by his eloquence, then by his audacity. The Second Republic, the adventure of the year 13, however, was not born with the best auspices. More difficult than winning over Caracas will be keeping it, and the fact that Bolívar has made his way through hostile camps does not mean that he has left his country free of enemies. Then and now there are those who say that those battles were nothing more than skirmishes. That the wars of South American independence cannot be compared with the enormous combats of the Napoleonic Wars. Bonaparte commanded armies of 250,000 men, in these battles there were never more than 10,000 on each side, and often only 15 or 2,000. But when we think about the magnitude of the things that were achieved with them, their importance increases considerably, and it increases even more when we think about the world where those wars were fought. Macer rightly says that the most important thing about these battles is the very theater in which they take place, that Europe is a pleasant field of poppies next to the hardships that the American landscape entails, that, furthermore, the entire European scene was known and codified by the generals since the remotest antiquity, while in this America everything was yet to be known and discovered. What was once called the art of war was fully invented in Europe, in America it had to be invented. The same can be said of the art of building bridges, of opening roads, of founding towns. That is why that epic glow that colonization feats have here, the opening of roads, the founding of villages on the precipices, the simple classification of nature. How much more will these selfless battles not only try to liberate a world but to invent it, which not only try to mobilize armies but to make them rise to the rhythm of the challenges. Even the old hacienda of San Mateo, where he had spent his childhood, Bolívar had to rediscover it as a theater of war. It was there that the young man from Granada, Antonio Ricaurte, whom we saw desert out of brotherly love in Ventaquemada, who later suffered the contempt of the troops and benefited from the indulgence of Nerino, and whom Bolívar, in a noble gesture, rescued from his voluntary exile in Anolema haciendas to give him a place in the Liberation Army, that boy, overwhelmed by guilt, by the weight of a moment of weakness, suddenly saw the opportunity to redeem himself by wreaking havoc on the enemy. And he immolated himself by shooting at the powder keg that surrounded him. All learning was hard and cruel. The Royalists, seeing that America was vanishing in their hands, resorted to the most lurid methods and did not stop at any crime. Bolívar, instructed by his first failure, answered them with the same gloom. Those serviles, who call themselves our enemies, have violated international law. But these victims will be avenged and these serviles exterminated. Our vengeance will equal the cruelties of the Spaniards, for our clemency is exhausted. Since our oppressors force this deadly war, they will disappear from the face of America. And our soil will be cleansed of these monsters that sully it. Our hatred knows no boundaries, and this is a war to the death. That was the name given to that horror. With the lost fortress of Porto Cabello hanging over him like remorse and a threat, always on the verge of once again being the cause of his defeat, Bolívar came and went with his troops in a coming and going of deeds and horrors that filled the entire year of 14 and in which looting abounded, massacres and crimes, days of biblical cruelty, offenses that were paid for with grievances, torments that were paid for with infamies, an evil contest in which men like the Spanish Campo Elias stood out, passed to the side of the Republicans, who came to hate his own countrymen so much that he said that after killing them all he would kill himself so that not a single Spaniard would be left alive. Or like Cerveris, the royalist who paid 1 peso for each enemy's ear, or like Zuazola, mutilator of prisoners, or like the horrendous Bubs himself, the great enemy of the patriots, who unleashed the mulattoes and Plains Indians against the whites. And he was capable of dining cordially with a man whom he had already decided he would have beheaded after dinner. Bolívar, in those sinister days, responded to horror with horror, authorized savage campaigns because it seemed to him that it was the only way to deprive enemies of the primacy of intimidation, and it was then that he decided things as difficult to forgive as the shooting of 800 Spanish prisoners. Monteverde had refused to accept the exchange of prisoners that Bolívar demanded of him. The enemy troops were charging against the Patriot army. Bolívar knew well that against him and his men there would be no mercy, and he also knew that those 800 Spaniards collaborating with the army realistic would reduce his revolutionary army to rubble in a few days. Those considerations dictated by the infernal character of the war do not exempt it from the rigorous judgment of history, nor do they protect it from our reprobation, but long before we could comment on his cruelty and his hell, reality had already charged Bolívar and his names with the harsh deeds to which the inertia of the conflict dragged them. Violence attracts violence, and if the violence of the Royalists attracted the violent war to the death of the Patriots, their violence in turn attracted the cruelty of Bubs at the head of an unexpected army of plainsmen, the gauchos of the north, the children of the swamp, the tigers of the Morichales, men of silent battles, of those charges in which not a single shot sounds, but the piercing wind of deadly spears. For Bolívar to come to command that force of nature that were the horsemen of the plain, so that he could defeat the Spaniards with them from the Pantano de Vargas to Junin, he first had to know them in the most minute way, being defeated by them. This was a constant in his life, to be defeated first by the forces he would eventually learn to lead or defeat. And the more formidable the obstacles rose, the more remarkable was his triumph over them in the end. But of all the defeats that were his learning, perhaps the saddest, and certainly the bloodiest, was the fall of the Second Republic before the advance of the plainsmen led by Bubs, that resentful and cruel man. When Bolívar, after a year of attacking and resisting, of fighting in La Puerta, in Aragua and in Carabobo, of liberating and losing neighboring territories, had to abandon Caracas and go back east at the head of a caravan of 20,000 people, many of them women, the elderly and children, fleeing the royalists' revenge, could see the most atrocious face of the war. The feared hell was finally coming, the brief spring of independence, proclaimed without blood in the days of April 1810, signed without blood a year later, lost in La Guaira and reborn as a miracle in the admirable campaign, was now sinking under the arms of the Spanish. After 4 years of freedom and resistance, Venezuela fell. In the distance, Ferdinand VII had regained his freedom and the crown, Napoleon was expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain defeated the Patriots using the mestizo warriors of the plains for victory, and the worst was yet to come, the ships of the Army of the Reconquest. It was the year 1814 when Bolívar left Venezuela, defeated for the second time, now under the savage charge of the Bov's plainsmen. The withdrawal from Caracas was a holocaust, thousands of people suffered the unspeakable and retreated, leaving their parents and children dead along a frightful path. To add bitterness, Bolívar and Moreno, previously rivals, embarked on Bianchi's squad, 11 trying to recover 24 boxes with all the silver from the churches of Caracas, the treasure from which the fight for independence was to be reborn, and their men they thought they had fled with the treasure. Their Bolívar would relieve the confusing episodes of 2 more years, when Miranda was preparing to set sail and his own men captured him. You will also have noticed how easily moves can be misinterpreted in the midst of big defeats. It was not enough for Bolívar and Moreno to return with the treasure, rescued in a fictional adventure by sea, and hand it over to the revolutionary command. Bolívar needed all his eloquence not to end up shot or delivered like Miranda to the dungeons of Iberia. But after 1,000 adventures, gun in hand, there goes Bolívar back into exile, once again exiled and lonely. Already on one occasion the patriots of New Granada had received him and helped him. They had given him a troop and a small command, and above all they had given him their admiration and trust, although perhaps at this hour they would not be very happy that he had taken the initiative and, disobeying orders from his immediate superior, had advanced from the border to Venezuela. The final authorization to invade the territory of his country had almost been forced by his actions. Bolívar had in his favor the successful result of that advance, that admirable campaign that was the first definitive revelation of his military genius and of his destiny. However, this could be of very little use because now the Second Venezuelan Republic, the meritorious fruit of that disobedience, was smoke and ashes under the flight of vultures. Would the Granadans receive the insubordinate outlaw again? There was no other option but to try, and for the second time New Granada was his second homeland. This time the fortress of Cartagena, where, moreover, he had adversaries, was not enough for Bolívar. I needed to find the center of the Federated States. He sailed down the Magdalena and went up the Savannah to Tunja, where Camilo Torres, President of Parliament, had only to talk to him to confirm his feeling that he was not dealing with just any rebel. There his power made itself felt, what Pétion later perceived in Haiti, what the Foreign Minister of England had warned during his interview with the young Venezuelan ambassador in London, what the gentleman from Kingston to whom Bolívar addressed the letter would experience later. Of Jamaica, what everyone who came into contact with this captivating personality felt, the strength of a character. There is no other way to understand why Bolívar, in all the circumstances, defeated, banished, feverish, consumed, destroyed, remained psychologically so powerful, so convincing, to the point that his men, when they heard him defeated, raved with that he was going to take over the entire continent. They whispered to each other that the general was crazy, but they did not stop following his orders and taking care of him like a treasure. Bolívar, Moreno said, would have convinced the stones. But Camilo Torres not only perceived the strength of character of the man from Caracas, he felt something else, and managed to express it admirably. There are phrases in history that have the virtue of summarizing vast and complex phenomena. Camilo Torres was the fortress that protected Bolívar and gave him the strength to assume his destiny. Helping him up after the fall gave him an invaluable sense of his own worth, and he understood before anyone else that he was not dealing with a man but with a historical force. Today, seeing the magnitude of his victory and his legend, We all feel that Bolívar managed to embody with amazing conviction the dream of an era, merge the ideal of independence, longing for the colonies, with the ideal of freedom, found autonomous republics based on the new political order born of the Enlightenment. But it commands respect that the President of the Congress of New Granada saw all this in the act, that he saw from the beginning in Bolívar what history would later reveal, that he was possessed by an irresistible force, that there was in him a decision that nothing could stop. By tracing the parable of that meteor for history, Torres made his own insight evident. He shows us Bolívar as the man who embodies destiny but at the same time paints himself as a lucid and visionary witness. Where Bolívar is, he said, the Republic is. Once more, Bolívar received a troop and restarted his campaign. Now the circumstances were more serious. Free Fernando VII, a reconquest army crossed the ocean determined to crush all the foci of rebellion and resistance that burned like bonfires in the old colonies, and that is something that Bolívar already sensed. 40 merchant ships, escorted by 18 warships, brought 6 regiments of infantry and 2 of cavalry across the Atlantic, and at the command of the army of 12,000 men was Pablo Murillo, the general who had defeated Napoleon's armies, expelled the invaders, won Spanish independence and returned the crown to its king. The threat was immense. Nariño was imprisoned in a cell in Cádiz, the provinces were still at odds and the shadow of the dragon was already growing larger on the horizon. Here we find again the kaleidoscope of Colombian discord. Now it was Tunja that called for union and Santaf that opposed any alliance. On this occasion, Bolívar managed to hold Bogotá, which at first saw in him what they had been preached to him, a bloodthirsty guerrilla, an anti-clerical rebel, an executioner of prisoners. Success opened doors and raised excommunications. The city was seduced by the new commander of the troops. Thus Bolívar entered one of the cities that would remain most closely linked to his memory, and the speech of the Union of all Americans against Spain seemed to fall on fertile ground in the immense green savanna, at 2,600 meters above sea level, which had dazzled Humboldt for its beauty and for its intellectual brilliance. José Celestino Mutis was no longer there, who for decades classified the tropical flora while exchanging letters with Linnaeus, and led the team of magnificent painters who made the prints of the botanical expedition flourish, the scientific and aesthetic adventure that awoke the equinoctial America to the Enlightenment and the insurrection. But there were the gentlemen who had gone out on cavalcade to receive Humboldt and Bonpland 12 years before, and the heroic generation of scholarly researchers and patriots that a year later Murillo would turn into food for buzzards. The need to unite the territory was increasingly urgent, and Bolívar tried to serve as an instrument of alliance between these communities. He reminded them that union was the only talisman, but he was unable to convince them, and it is not surprising that some time later he ended up saying, from the bitterness of his final disappointments, that every Colombian is an enemy country. He wanted to unite the provinces under a single flag. He moved troops to the south, where Nariño had failed. He sent Urdaneta to the border with Venezuela, who over the years would be one of his most faithful generals, and meanwhile he turned the reins to the north, thinking of sealing the alliance with the coastal region. Thus he returned to Mompox, where his star had first shone, and began to send messages to Cartagena, suddenly converted into the stuck wheel of that campaign. Then 2 worse enemies rose against his army, smallpox and fever. The disagreement of the sister provinces persisted, while the wind in the sails of the imperial squadron could almost be heard in the distance. Bolívar knew that the isolation of the people of Cartagena would not allow them to resist the reconquest. He exhorted them once again to seal the union with the rest of the provinces, to form a single army to face the landing of the royal army, and the refusal, encouraged by the animosity of the rancorous Colonel Manuel del Castillo, seemed so stupid to him, that Bolívar almost fell into the temptation of laying siege to Cartagena, to force the patriots themselves to agree to an alliance with the rest of the provinces. The idea was desperate, like the circumstances, but it could not succeed, and Bolívar let it die at his hands. There was no remedy. New Granada would once again fall into the hands of the Spanish crown. He felt like the guest who sees danger and is more interested in saving the house than the owners themselves. Those he wanted to save treated him like an outsider. So he decided to surrender his troops and go into exile, more defeated than ever. They would soon understand that even in his attempt to lay siege to Cartagena he had been right, that even fighting them he had come close to saving them. On May 2, 1814, he embarked for the Caribbean, unaware that Murillo's army was entering Caracas that same day. He was stripped and pensive through the islands while his homeland was falling into the hands of the enemy. Thus his premonitions were fulfilled, and thus began his adventure in Jamaica. The traveler who landed in Jamaica in 1815, carrying some trunks with papers and books, his clothes, and a few hammocks, was accompanied by his aides-de-camp Pease and Scipio, and two slaves, Andres and Pio, whom he affectionately called Piato. The hammocks and the slaves would be central elements of an incredible episode, which convinced Bolívar himself that he had an auspicious star in the sky. He also told Peru de la Croix about it during the tense days in Bucaramanga, near the end of his life, while they awaited the results of the Ocana Convention, when everything had already fallen into the hands of the enemies, and it was feared that men from Santander they will attack him. Perhaps to reassure the soldiers who were guarding him in a way that was both discreet and anguished, he said that nothing protects us as much as luck, and he gave them a detailed account of the Jamaican episode. Poor and proscribed, he had stayed with his companions in an inn in Kingston, where he had his hammock installed, but annoyed with the behavior of the owner, and without telling anyone else, he went out with his slave Andres to look for better lodging. When he found it, he sent the slave for his free hammock, his sword, and his pistols. He said that he had decided to spend the night there, after having dinner with a businessman who had invited him to the countryside, but others say that then one of those biblical Caribbean downpours that erase the world broke over the city, and that Bolívar decided to take shelter in the house was empty until it cleared up, while Andres stayed in the initial lodging, where his master had an important appointment with a former supplier of the Patriot Army, Mr. Emistoy, who was to leave on a commission to Los Cayos the next day. Bolívar is already alone in his new and dismantled room, with only his hammock and his weapons. Meanwhile, at the inn, the caterer waits. Night falls, the hours pass and the general does not arrive. Mr. Emistoy, exhausted by sleep, reclines in Bolívar's hammock, which now seems, seen by us from such a distance, the only object that adorns that room. Then a shadow enters the shadowy room, sneaks up to the hammock, and without giving the sleeper time to react, believing it to be Bolívar, stabs the poor vendor who was waiting for him. The slave Andres wakes up with the agitation, approaches, sees Emistoy already dead or still dying. And he only thinks that the murderer is going to kill his master too. He runs to the new house and tells Bolívar about the tragedy that has just occurred, the death he has just been saved from. And suddenly Pio, the other slave, who had been following the first, arrives at the house. He is a boy of only 19 years. Bolívar, who notices him upset and nervous, questions him. Finally the slave collapses and confesses that he was the murderer. A Spaniard had seduced him into killing his master. It was very hard for Bolívar to accept that a boy who had been by his side for years, who for years had taken care of his house and watched over his sleep, had not only suddenly become a murderer, but was willing to kill his own lord. More amazing is that he did it just the night that Bolívar was not the one sleeping in the hammock. A better fate is impossible, and this episode, together with others, strengthened in the general that curious invulnerability syndrome that Caesar and Napoleon also suffered from. Caesar felt that if he was in it, the boat could not capsize. Napoleon thought that if he was the one who kissed those hands of plague patients and lepers, it was impossible for the contagion to reach him. Others have suggested, Garcia Marquez among them, that on that occasion Bolívar's fate had a name, that his date in the field was not with an English businessman but with his wife, Miranda Lindsay, that the tropical storm was rather the claims of an almost loving encounter. But there is no secret or furtive act of Bolívar to which a gallant cause cannot be attributed, From his break with the Bonapartists in Paris in 1804 to his broken ear one morning in Lima, from his visit to the antechambers of Queen Maria Luisa to the catastrophic loss of all the supplies that Pétion had offered him, which were scattered on the beach of Ocumare in the deadly year of 1816 and that the enemy collected because Bolívar had arrived late to the combat, from the capture of a ship on the high seas in a typical episode of corsairs, so that the beautiful Josefina Machado could be saved from the war, to the slap Bolívar received at the hands of a young girl at a party in Cauca, from his mysterious sleeplessness after entering Bogotá in August 1819, after being crowned by Bernardina Ibáñez, a 15-year-old maid, and the long platonic love that obsessed him with her ever since and made him write feverish letters to the secret nights of the government palace when others say that he managed to consummate that romantic passion, from the superstitions of the troops who considered the sexual plenitude of their chief to be part of the secrets of the war, to the French and Latin verses that came and went during the endless party in Quito in 1822, when, after the triumphal procession under the rains of flowers, Bolívar danced all night with the woman who had thrown a crown at him from the balcony that afternoon and hit him in the chest with it. We know that that night he said to Manuela, his new and fascinating dance partner, "If my soldiers had their aim, we would have already defeated the Spanish." But since that meeting, in the last 8 years of his life, and for the first time since the death of his wife in his hazy adolescence, Bolívar had a mistress, and a mistress who defended his rights with fingernails. José Palacios, the faithful servant who is so difficult to find in history because of his discretion and invisible efficiency, found the general one day bleeding, with a broken ear and scratches on his face and arms. The first thing he thought was that it was a new attack, but Bolívar told him the truth. Manuela had found an earring in her own bed that was not hers. To battles of love, field of feathers. Every island, it is known, is the top of a mountain. It was in Jamaica, outlawed, and thus guarded by love and death, where Bolívar finally had the great vision of the continent as a whole and of the fight he had to wage to obtain his freedom. The destiny of America has been irrevocably fixed, the tie that united it to Spain is severed. At the height of isolation, he gazed out over the enormity of his world, seeking to see far into space and time. He meditated on the natural borders, on the identity of the colonies, on the difference in national physiognomies that geography and politics had already traced. The Jamaica Charter was the fruit of that meditation, one of the founding documents of Latin America. From the examination of the clash of the worlds that occurred in the conquest, he goes through the regions, examines their character, their differences. He notices how the centuries and the policies, the geography and the customs, have formed different human communities, true nations. More than any other, I desire to see America form the greatest nation in the world, less for its size and riches than for its freedom and glory. Although I aspire to perfection in the government of my country, I cannot persuade myself that the New World is for the time being governed by a great republic. As it is impossible, I dare not wish for it, and even less do I wish for a universal monarchy of America, because this project, without being useful, is also impossible. The abuses that currently exist would not be reformed, and our regeneration would be fruitless. It is a grandiose idea to try to form from the whole New World a single nation with a single link that links its parts to each other and to the whole. Since it has an origin, a language, customs, and a religion, it should therefore have a single government that would confederate the different states that are to be formed, but it is not possible because remote climates, diverse situations, opposing interests, dissimilar characters divide America. Even nature conspired to separate us. Between Argentina and Chile, that mountain range constituted an almost ineluctable natural barrier. In Argentina itself, everything seemed far from everything. Bolívar must have realized that even the Republic would take a long time to physically and symbolically occupy all that extension, that Patagonia that consumed the eyes, that infinite pampa that alternated seas of alfalfa with deserts of thistles. He also thought of that upper Peru that not even Peru was able to dominate. He could not foresee that there, where the highest sea is, a country would be born that would bear his name. He thought of those countries that, like lost shores, border Brazil on three sides and never reach it because it is prevented by a jungle so large that it is a world in itself. From the beginning, Mexico and Peru, the niches of the greatest pre-Hispanic empires, had been the centers of Spanish power. From 1535 the Viceroyalty of Mexico projected its influence on Central America. Since 1542, the Viceroyalty of Peru governed the Andes mountain range. The last to be founded had been, in 1776, the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, and half a century before, in 1717, the Viceroyalty of New Granada had existed, where the third great indigenous kingdom of America had been. When events are not assured, when the state is weak, and when undertakings are remote, all men waver, opinions are divided, passions stir them, and enemies encourage them to succeed by this easy means. Of the provinces that did not feel the weight of these courts, some could feel even less recognized by the crown, and saw the ideas of the time circulating through them. Because of its ports, Venezuela was the region of South America that was most open to the Caribbean Sea, through which revolutionary ideas circulated, more dangerous than pirate squads. And as always, as since the days of the Audiencia de Santo Domingo, it was in the area of influence of that great island that had previously been called La Española but now could well be called La Francesa. The rule of Spain ended in America and the influence of France began. After we are strong, under the auspices of a liberal nation that lends us its protection, we will be seen to agree to cultivate the virtues and talents that lead to glory. Then we will continue the majestic march towards the great prosperity to which humanity is destined. South America. Then the sciences and arts that were born in the East and have enlightened Europe, will fly to free Colombia that will invite them with an asylum. Perhaps more remarkable than the independence of the United States had been the independence of Haiti, where the cries of liberté, égalité, and fraternité rang out even more defiantly than in Paris or Marseilles. If in France liberal ideas were a bonfire, in Haiti they could not stop being a volcano. A people of slaves suddenly illuminated by the dawn of freedom took possession of their destiny with more audacity than force, and starred in one of those Caribbean revolutions that always achieve more by their projection on the world than by their own conquests. What a world the Caribbean was! It is true that the Atlantic practically did not exist for humans until 5 centuries ago, but from the moment in which the ideas of the Renaissance, the ships of the world market and the delusions of the Spain of the Austrians crossed the abyss, the chronicle of the Mediterranean paled next to Caribbean history. Through no sea have so many races passed, so many myths, so many gods, so much wealth and so much madness as through that pitcher full of magical lands where the ships of Spain went with Christ bleeding on the prow, the hooded officers of the Inquisition bringing the devil in their virtuous hooks, Moors who renounced the sands of Africa, humanists like Oviedo who knew Leonardo and Bimbo, Ariosto and Raphael, Andrea Mantegna and Giorgio Barbarelli, who painted music. Ships came heavy with plows and cloth and furniture, and they returned even heavier with gold bars, emerald monstrances, cargoes of mahogany and pearls. They came bringing chains to the towns of the future and they returned curing their pestilent cellars with rosewood fumes. Adventurers, traffickers, cartographers, mystics, chroniclers, genocides, madmen, beautiful monsters, and horrendous saints succeeded one another in that high tide of adventures, and behind came the slave ships, and behind the caravans of galleons, and behind the corsair squadrons sweeping the sea with their telescopes from the foaming needle of their 80-gun frigates. Bolívar's name was also written in the water. He had promised to help Cartagena and was still willing to do so. Upon embarking for Jamaica, he had warned his friends of the impending danger. Shortly after escaping from death in Kingston, he was determined to face the danger of reconquest from the walls. But, on their way to Cartagena, a schooner they crossed delivered the news that the walled city, defeated by the siege and the plagues, had fallen into the hands of the royal squadron. Murillo, who put the inhabitants of Boca Chica to death, was executing a whole generation of patriots. Even the hostile commander Castillo, who had opposed Bolívar with all his might, had been hanged from an old colonial lantern. he would understand at the last moment that his jealousy against Bolívar had been something worse than suicide, the sacrifice of his entire homeland. On the high seas, and faced with this news, Bolívar had to change course. Then the old star led him east to the island where liberal ideas had awakened a race. Only that country of rebellious slaves, Haiti, was in a position to help him restart his struggle. Bolívar knew of the existence of guerrillas throughout South America, and that it was possible to unify them and direct them against the common enemy, because Spain was present throughout the continent. But now a more fearsome Spain, hungry for its lost half-world, heavy with rifles and cannons, advanced determined to retake the provinces that had dared to declare their independence. It is hard to understand the ferocity with which they treated the American patriots, considering that those same Spanish soldiers had just waged a selfless war defending their homeland against the French invaders. The madness of ethnic idols has no limits. Half of the island of Santo Domingo, which Columbus had called Hispaniola, was for centuries a refuge for smugglers and adventurers. Out of the storms of it all arose a French colony, and at the end of the 18th century 200,000 slaves bowed under the iron of 12,000 lords and overseers. Then the breath of history passed by, bringing the cries of a rebellion, in the luxurious metropolis. Finally tired of its aristocracy and its kings, even the beggars spoke of freedom, equality, and fraternity. The three words were honey for the slaves prostrate in cotton and cane fields, under the almost fiercer tyranny of the tropical sun. A black emulator of Napoleon, Toussaint L'Ouverture, led the slave insurgency, but ended up in the dungeons of France. Dessalines did not give up the fight, and Haiti became the first free country in Latin America. When Bolívar arrived, the experiment had already been going on for several years, one of the most significant rebellions in history. President Pétion received Bolívar and listened to the detailed presentation of his hemispheric project. Bolívar knew how to make the impossible seem possible, says Masser, speaking of the dialogues between the two men. Pétion felt like others the intelligence, the eloquence, the firmness of a decision. He saw that there was one of those forces that needed to be encouraged, and he offered them ships, arms, troops, and supplies. He only asked for one thing in return, the freedom of the slaves. That moment when two men in Haiti conceived the freedom of an oppressed race is one of the highest in our history. It was not a casual conversation between two friends on the islands, it was the spirit of the Enlightenment suddenly lighting up the entire hemisphere from the Caribbean. A new dream, which had nothing interesting or utilitarian, gave that interview a historical profile. Pétion did not even want to appear as the promoter of that idea, it was enough that it be fulfilled, and he asked for it with conviction. Bolívar, who had already freed his own slaves, and was always sure of his triumph, immediately promised her. It was going to be very difficult to keep that promise. To wage war against the mother country, armies always needed the support of Creole landowners, who were willing to do anything but sacrifice their property, and slaves were the most productive of those properties. When, much later, the states decreed the abolition of slavery, did not the slaveholders use the discourse of human rights to oppose those decrees? Preaching freedom for slaves was a desecration of the sacred right of property. Bolívar did not manage to get beyond the decision to free his own slaves. His personal sympathy was with them, since in a certain way he was the son of slaves, since with them he had drunk in his childhood what Shakespeare called the milk of the human tenderness. But there was not only trust and tenderness in him, the memory of Pio, the slave who after accompanying him for years had tried to kill him, made him feel that the victims of slavery did not need charity but a worthy place in the social order. His freedom, like that of the others, had to be won in struggle. And we already know that the decrees abolishing slavery were not enough to correct the evil sown for centuries. Despite the fact that so many slaves participated in the war for independence and gave their lives for it, a considerable part of that debt has not yet been paid. Who are these men who pass with Bolívar on the beaches of Haiti, talking about a new landing on the Venezuelan coast? Every day exiles from South America arrive at the western ports of Hispaniola. and it is moving to remember that time when Haiti, the Republic of Free Slaves, was the north of all freedom fighters, the only welcoming port in a hostile ocean guarded by despotism. We would like to see those faces that time has not erased, pronounce those names that are remembered by history in so many different ways. Under the tutelage of Pétion, this group of conspirators each has a purpose for their homelands and their personal destinies. The 27-year-old boy is Santiago Moreno. At 24 he lived through the disaster of the First Republic. At 25 he commanded an expedition through eastern Venezuela and liberated Cumana and Barcelona. At 26 he managed to defeat the cruel Bubs in Boca Chica, fought alongside Bolívar in the First Battle of Carabobo. After the defeat he also went to Cartagena and Jamaica. Now he is eager to set sail from Los Cayos to face Murillo, to rescue Venezuela again. The one who comes to his side is José Francisco Bermúdez. He is 33 years old and has also participated in all the days of freedom. Neither he nor Moreno is still very different from Bolívar. In the years to come they will alternately be seen fighting on his side or at odds with him. In Guerilla, even in a few months, we will see Bermúdez facing Bolívar, who makes his way sword in hand along a beach, trying to embark towards the islands. In the kaleidoscope of this war, one day they are allies, another they are adversaries, then they are brought together again by the understanding of their mistakes, the discovery of other evidence, the light that triumphs shed on previous conduct, the way in which a helping hand, a generous effort, they suddenly show the one who doubted them the sincerity or the true value of a man. Some of them will die in their beds, others in exile, others killed by a bullet that comes from the past, when the war seemed to be over. The one who is talking to Bolívar is José Leandro Palacios. The year Bolívar dies in Santa Marta, this man will be in Paris seeing the barricades of another revolution, as ambassador to France of a nation that is disintegrating, Gran Colombia. And this other one is Francisco Antonio Zia, born in Medellin, Mutiz's partner in the New Granada Botanical Expedition, later director of the Royal Botanical Garden of Madrid. He has accepted the dubious honor of being the second in the Ministry of the Interior of Spain under the fleeting reign of José Bonaparte, and now he is invited by Pétion to join the Department of Agriculture. Later he will be Minister Plenipotentiary of Greater Colombia in London and Paris. He will negotiate the first loans for the new republic. He will lose Bolívar's friendship. He will process another loan for £5 million sterling, but he will not be able to finish that process. Within 7 years he will die in Bath, where he will have gone to seek health in the thermal waters that Caesar's men channeled so many centuries ago. And here is Admiral Luis Bryan, from Curaçao, Bolívar's ally and chief of supplies, sometimes a businessman and sometimes a pirate, gambler and adventurer, a passionate and prodigal man, cultured and a friend of freedom. To remember him, there are two phrases that Bolívar has said about him. The first of gratitude, Admiral Bryan has an altar of gratitude in all Colombian hearts. The second of admiration, he is the freest of men. At his side is the Scotsman MacGregor, another ambitious adventurer, who will one day call himself Brigadier General of the United Provinces of New Granada and Venezuela, and General-in-Chief of the armies of the two Floridas. And there is the French combatant Louis Michel Ory, a brave man, who has just rescued numerous Carthagenans on his ships, breaking the siege of the besieged city. He will fight later for the freedom of Mexico and Central America, will participate with the Venezuelans in an adventure worthy of memory, the creation of the ephemeral Republic of Florida, the republic that lasted 60 days. Enemies with Bolívar, he will finally retire to Old Providence, the island of horses and bitter manzanitas, which he will turn into an impregnable fortress, and where he will put an end to so many adventures by accidentally falling off a horse in 1821. Even more behind comes Robert Shout Erland, the good English merchant who will help Pétion make the payments for these freedom fighters. And among these men advancing along the beach is one of those who would later slander Bolívar the most, one who would later spend long vigils writing a book to defame the liberator, for not having appointed him to a position he claimed, the Frenchman de Coudray-Holstein. But the most tragic figure of this whole group is that of Manuel Piar. He is one of the most influential men in the campaign for freedom, the most powerful of the generals that Bolívar has appointed, and for now he is his unrestricted ally, and more than once he will lend him his decisive support in times of crisis. Both he and Bermudez and Moreno aspire to be the top leaders of the insurrection. But the other two will understand in time that Bolívar has become the leader, that the troops acclaim him, that the peoples follow him, that his thought marks the course of the war, that no one like him knows how to see in advance the path of victory. PR will not know how to accept the power of Bolívar. Of all these enthusiastic conspirators who are protected by the wings of Pétion, PR is the only one who will lose his life at the hands of his own friends. In a not distant day, Bolívar's hand will sign his death sentence, and PR will have played in this painting the harsh and mysterious role of traitor. For today, everyone prepares to invade the mainland. Bolívar has preached his lofty dreams to this group of fighters whom Massar calls the Parliament of the Dispossessed. And for now they are all allies. They don't know what we already know, they hear the waves coming, they sense the battles, they dream of victory, they hear Bolívar's energetic and excited voice. They cannot imagine that, 2 centuries later, we are trying to see them, walking and arguing, all still friends, on that friendly beach. Of course there were discussions and disagreements, because Bermudez and Moreno wanted one thing, and PR another, and Luis Ori another, but Pétion set as the only condition that Bolívar be the head of the campaign, and Bryan supported that demand. The network of causes that led Bolívar to be the maximum leader of this revolution is impossible to unravel, like Iris's mantle. The voice of the native soil, his aristocratic pride, the mobility that wealth gives, the loneliness of his early childhood, the love of his black wet nurse, the friendship of that young slave, Matea, with whom he used to ride as a child around the hacienda, the intellectual arrogance of his teacher Andrés Bello, proud son of America, the proximity of the court, having witnessed the Napoleonic consecration, all these things came together in the torrent that made Bolívar the great radical. And there was the sermon of Simon Rodriguez and the Procente of Rousseau, who even today incites the subversion of customs and reconciliation with nature, should be both a clean fire and a song of pure water at the end of the 18th century, and especially in those prairies of America, which were filling with forebodings. The rebellion was born everywhere, but not everywhere with the same radically. Without us knowing why, more convinced than anyone else of the need for independence, Bolívar was the one who persisted in it with the most obstinacy. Liberal ideas were just emerging from the furnace of history, and he had already made them his fire forever, his reason for living and the work of his days. How many other things would not have been wood for that fire, the profusion of Iberian blood that was in his blood, or the vague family legends that every good mestizo listens to, such as the legend of that Ana Maria de Martínez Villegas y Ladrón de Guevara, one of her great-grandmothers, who claimed descent from Carima, the cacique of the Maya Valley on Margarita Island, or like the legend, even more secret, of her grandmother Petronila de Ponte y Marin, daughter of a mulatto woman, Josefa, buried in a white cemetery, who left enough African blood in the rivers of his lineage for the rebellion and for the dance. Bolívar not only cradled the visionary dream of liberating the provinces and giving them autonomous life in republics, he conceived all this on a very unruly ground and in the early days when European republics were just being born. If he was like few others at the height of the times, of the comprehensive and critical view of Voltaire, of the republican ideas of Montesquieu, of the radicalism of the French revolutionaries, it can also be said that his dream went beyond his time. He had the fire of love for the land of Joan of Arc or Danton, and a recklessness worthy of the Prince of Condé, but also a design for the one who was early in the world, an idea that they had only conceived, for a more limited territory. And homogeneously, the colonies of New England. You always hear the ghost of the empires that were passed by, the archetype, the Roman Empire, the legendary empire of Charlemagne, the fantastic empire of King Arthur, the planetary empire of Charles V. Louis XIV dreamed of expanding France over the world, Charles XII tried to establish a great Sweden, Peter the Great founded his vast Russia, and Bonaparte conceived of an entire Europe, but all these attempts were born under the sign of the monarchy. What America brought new to the world, the promise of large Allied territories, in the north and south of the continent, was something very different. It was Jefferson and Bolivar who first conceived of great democratic federations, a liberal union of modern republics. One of the most difficult tasks was to match the dream of independence with the dream of freedom. For the majority of Creoles, breaking with the power of the crown was equivalent only to establishing their own feudal power, with or without their own monarch, and few could welcome the idea of founding a society of equality and fraternity. Almost until the day before, the Indians had been the enemy, the absolute opposite, the blacks, the unrestricted server. How to assume suddenly, as if by magic, the dream of an unheard of egalitarian Arcadia? At this point we must situate one of the most complex facts of Bolivar's adventure, his conflict with PR in Venezuela. PR was not black. For a long time it seems that he denied being the son of a black mother from the islands, but from a certain moment, perhaps from when he realized that Bolivar was going to become the maximum leader of the revolution, he began to claim his status as a mulatto, and to speak increasingly hostile to the white Creole leadership. He affirmed that the revolution should be a struggle of Indians and blacks, not only against the Spaniards but against the whites, and very soon the rebellion ceased to be a political struggle against Spanish domination in his discourse and became a racial conflict. Bolivar warned of the danger. PR was a great leader, an outstanding military man, a man to whom the revolution owed victories and exploits. If his discourse found its way, the War of Independence would literally lose its bearings. Of course Bolivar was also defending his own place in the revolution. Was he, as a white man, and as a member of the Creole aristocracy, going to be denied the right to fight, the right to be an American and to fight for his land? Bolivar also thought that PR was not even sincere. His sudden devotion to Indians and slaves seemed to him a mixture of resentment and opportunism. Beyond defending his own place in the campaign, Bolivar saw in that racist preaching a tendency that could make the revolution fail forever. If the white Creoles and the white mestizos did not have a place in the Republic, if rather they were considered enemies of the American people, the war against the Spanish power was going to transform into a civil war between Americans and the power of the crown would be strengthened. For a long time, to tolerate PR's speech in the army's own ranks was to endanger independence, but it was not just a speech. Increasingly, PR began to impede the progress of the war, flouting instructions, disobeying orders, and even frustrating the coordinated movements of the patriots. A new enemy suddenly arose in the very ranks of the revolution. Bolivar warned him that he could not continue with that behavior. There is a line of command, he told her, and the course of the war depends on respecting it. We could object that Bolivar himself disobeyed his hierarchical superiors more than once and was even proud of it. Shortly before, a fortunate disobedience had allowed him to enter Venezuela with the boy soldiers from Mompox and Cucuta, advance from the west and refound the republic. Bolivar would reply that his insubordination and disobedience never endangered the patriots and always served to advance the cause of freedom. He kept telling PR, if you were the boss, I would follow you. Now I am the boss and you have a duty to follow me. He offered him the alternative of retiring from the army if he did not share his orientation. But if he withdraws, he told her, he will really withdraw. I will not tolerate him continuing to hinder our actions and fight us. PR, indignant, agreed to withdraw, but continued to attack the process. No one accused him of having allied himself with the enemy, but, lying in ambush in the jungles, he conspired and acted against Bolivar and his troops, until the general reached the point of impatience and ordered his capture. An advance guard of the Patriot Army pursued PR, cornered him in the thicket and captured him. PR, who had behaved like a fool, after having been one of the pillars of the army, still trusted that Bolivar would take his merits into account, and did not realize that he had crossed a dark door of no return. But for Bolivar it was no longer a matter of patience. There appeared the relentless man in that small body, stoic in the face of hardship, tireless in campaigns, bold and sagacious in the midst of combat, and always ready for the victory dance. It was not Bolívar who sentenced PR to death, it was done by a court-martial summoned by him. But once the sentence was handed down, it was up to Bolívar to execute or pardon. PR, in prison, juggled with hope. Bolívar will not sign, it was said. When they told him that Bolívar had signed, he belatedly understood the seriousness of the events. They say her eyes filled with tears. Bolívar had done him the honor of not accepting being demoted. He will die with all his titles, he said. PR, tearing at his shirt with a gesture, popped the buttons and fell convulsing to the floor. But then he bravely faced death, asked the soldiers to aim well, and did not close his eyes. The officers who had advised Bolívar to pardon PR feared a rebellion by the soldiers, a division of the army. None of that happened. PR's execution reminded everyone in the troops that the war was for real, that the discipline was ruthless, and apparently strengthened Bolívar's prestige as leader, further asserting his power. This is one of the episodes in Bolívar's life that his critics most reject and that his worshippers tend to forget the most. The humanist spirit of our time tends to be indulgent towards the soldier who kills in combat, tolerant towards confrontations where there is minimal equality between the opponents, but sees every unequal confrontation with severity, and with open rejection the death of someone unarmed at the hands of someone armed or a whole troop. Against the conceptual watermarks of political realism, today we reject the death penalty in any case and we judge those who apply it to be cruel. The idea of necessary executions, so common in war, and whose extreme case is the execution by his companions of the cowardly soldier, tends to disgust the conscience of those of us who are not in combat, even if we are told that we are beneficiaries of these crimes. Bolívar not only shot PR, in an act that was perhaps the efficient cause of his authority and victory, he launched the war to the death, and other times he ordered things that shake us, like the aforementioned execution of 800 prisoners who were guilty of no other crime than being Spanish, powerful, and influential. That an ill-treated or ignorant being commits a homicide, or that a person alienated by illness or passion does it, is easier to understand than if it is done by someone thoughtful and sensitive, who must not only govern his actions by law but by a resolute and incorruptible morality. That is why it is so difficult to approve these executions. These are facts that we feel irremediably evil, that can be understood in the midst of the maelstrom of war but that are repugnant to the conscience of humanity, in the even precarious peace of the republics. As a character in Garcia Marquez says, you always have to be on the side of the dead. We react not as members of a faction but as alarmed members of the human species, capable of understanding the desperation and embarrassment of the warrior who kills in battle, or in a confused act of defense, but not the one who kills coldly and meekly, even if the codes of war or the solemn letter of the law acquit him. It was also Garcia Marquez who once said that he was not only against the death penalty but against death itself. In 1858, commissioned to write a biographical note for the New American Cyclopedia, Karl Marx mysteriously lavished all kinds of disqualifications on the work and days of Simon Bolívar. Reading that text still causes perplexity. It does not seem possible to understand that a researcher would have insisted on accumulating false or inaccurate arguments in such a way to condemn a historical figure. The curious thing is that Marx did not neglect the details, he found out the facts and to a certain extent studied the circumstances, but his entire text is conceived to show Bolívar as an irrefutable example of cowardice, opportunism, and molly goodnighting. Today, after the meticulous work of biographers such as Gerhard Masser or John Lynch, it is possible to refute Marx's tendentious information point by point and conclude that it was guided by the conscious purpose of discrediting Bolívar, of condemning him to history. Many argue that Marx, to write that article that would bring him a few pounds, limited himself to looking at some facts, consulting partial and very unreliable sources, and reacting to them without further analysis. He himself cites as one of his sources Colonel Hip Esley, one of the members of the British Legion, who fought under Bolívar's orders and who, after being denied the rank of brigadier general, says Masser, returned to his country and devoted himself to the task of slandering Bolívar. Another of his sources was the book by de Coudray-Holstein, whom we recently saw accompanying Bolívar on a beach in Haiti. But Marx, who by then had written such notable works as the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, was not exactly a careless reader, and he not only had access to documents written by personal enemies of the liberator, but also had sufficient information at his fingertips to oppose those calumnies. Almost 3 decades after Bolívar's death, Will was already needed to be so wrong about historical facts that were well recognized in his time. Marx gleaned from the available data those that would serve to condemn Bolívar, and, what is even more rare, he did not find a single merit worth mentioning in the life of this warrior and statesman whose culture, whose courage, whose commitment, and whose victories posterity dare not deny. He did not, for example, attach the least importance to the fact that 5 nations had obtained their independence thanks above all to the obstinacy and political genius of Bolívar. He did not appreciate that one of the first historical struggles against colonialism had been waged and won in Latin American lands, that peoples prostrated by despotism and subjugated by arbitrariness had risen from the dust and had affirmed their dignity and their pride against a domination 3 times secular. Marx preferred to ignore all that and see only clumsiness, smallness, and treachery in the ins and outs of that existence. The fact was curious, and the very editor of the encyclopedia, Mr. Dana, claimed Marx in his time for having incurred reprehensible excesses in the very tone in which he wrote his article, having lost the sense of objectivity, having turned an academic article into a political invective and an impassioned moral smear. I don't remember if Marx managed to tell that, in Tenerife and Mompox, Bolívar had disobeyed his bosses in Cartagena, that in Cúcuta he took advantage of the partial permission he was given to occupy the border regions to advance with the intention of seizing Venezuela again. But of that disobedience, of that vague insubordination, it would be better to say, because in reality the armies he had been invented by Bolívar in a few weeks of daring movements along the Magdalena River and up the mountains, of that advance not authorized by distant chiefs, in times of difficult communications and in a world of enormous geographical obstacles, the Second Venezuelan Republic emerged from that daring campaign. What some could describe as a movement of indiscipline, for not attending to the jealousy of a small boss, was the admirable campaign, one of the most notable military and political events of its time, and one of the founding moments of the legend of Bolívar. The ultimate question in the vortex of a war is not who obeyed and who did not obey, but what were the consequences of those actions. In the Century of Louis XIV Voltaire, a book that Bolívar undoubtedly read, a footnote mentions Torstenson. Torstenson was a page to King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, in 1624. The king, about to attack an army of Livonians in Lithuania and not having his generals by his side, sent Torstenson to convey his orders to a general officer, to take advantage of a move he saw the enemies make. When Torstenson had already left, the enemy changed course, and the king was desperate because the order sent was already incorrect. Torstenson returned from his mission and said to the king, "Sir, deign to forgive me, but seeing that the enemy was making a contrary move, I gave the opposite order." The king said nothing, but that night, when the page was serving at table, he made him dine by his side and handed over command of the officers' guards. 15 days later he entrusted him with a brigade, then a regiment. Torstenson was one of the great captains of Europe. The matter does not seem to require further analysis, but I suspect that some serious risks of Marx's doctrines are as announced in that episode. Something that has to do with the look that Eurocentrism cast on the supposed periphery of the world, the pretense that the laws of history were dictated from Europe, the fatal suspicion that a Latin American feat could not be more than a bad caricature of European exploits. Something that perhaps came from the Hegelian thesis that America was not part of universal history, that these were only wild and picturesque lands. That judgment or prejudice allowed that, from the tower of a formidable Eurocentrism, even the philosophers eager for justice were capable of erasing with a stroke of the pen the highest historical adventure of Latin America, the stormy awakening of our continental conscience. Even then, For the eyes of Europe, America was invisible. Every historical protagonist demands a critical judgment, and in Bolívar as in any other it is possible to enumerate errors and deficiencies. But it is no longer possible to deny the essential importance of their struggle and the magnitude of their victory. If Latin America exists today, it is due to the efforts of that lucid, contradictory, and heroic generation, and perhaps no one in it played such a decisive role as Bolívar. On the other hand, there are few facts more just in history than the independence of America. A world so vast and complex could not continue to be tributary to a world that appreciated it so little and knew it so poorly. If Alejandro de Humboldt's illustrated voyage revealed something to Bolívar, it was his ignorance of Spanish absolutism, his lack of awareness of the brave new world that he had in his hands, and that, as long as he remained in them, he would never extract the magic juice of that bravery and that novelty. There are those who question whether the independence was opportune or if it happened at the wrong time. Nothing more vain than to examine the historical facts in this way. Who will say what is the exact date of a revolution? Who will decide when it is time to agree with the whole town? Bolívar did not invent the independence movement, it was underway everywhere when he joined the fight. There were rebels scattered throughout the continent, but Bolívar collected those forces like no one else and directed the storm. Some conditions were created, but given the dispersion of the patriots, the difficulty of the scenario and the forces of the enemy, failure was quite possible. There were times when the cause of liberty was lost. And it was there that the soldier, who was also a visionary and a poet, a philosopher and a leader, more than once made the flame of history reappear out of nowhere. Also in Spain backwardness and modernity, despotism and the desire for freedom were confronted. The despotic side of Spanish society, which brought about with the conquest one of the most vicious acts of war in the history of the world, came to mock the magnitude of the battles for American independence. In this way she tried to forget that those battles, small or large, stripped her of an entire continent, displaced her from the stage of history and founded a new age of the world. The hardships of our war of independence were complex and innumerable, but they do not respond to that apocalyptic pattern of European battles, populous carnage about which it is astonishing that someone could be vain. Rather, it should be noted how admirable it is that comparatively much less blood was released with what cost so much blood to subdue. Pretending that Bolívar and San Martín, that Hidalgo and Morelos, that Morazán and O'Higgins, that Nariño and Pise and Sucre and Artigas do not belong to universal history is like declaring that Immanuel Kant does not belong to the history of philosophy. But it is also a mistake to think that only with them and in the adventure of defeating Spain did we enter history. The so-called conquest of America is already one of the most moving and dramatic historical events of all time. 5 centuries ago Europe was seated in America, its races, its languages, its religions, its institutions, its market, its industry, its dreams, and its delusions, but it is also 5 centuries since America entered the body and soul of Europe, its products and its legends, the memory of an age of excess and dazzling, the deeds and remorse that would engender utopia and the myth of the noble savage, the dream of returning to nature and humanitarian law, the question of the other end. Romanticism. Perhaps without that first century of insane adventures in an unknown world, without that tension between the madness of Spain and its wisdom, between its heroic spirit and its fantasy, between its village spirit and its universal vocation, between its provincial limitation and its curiosity, between its confinement in the Middle Ages and its foundation of modernity, El Quijote would not have been born, a book that founded a literary genre but also an age of language, an era of humanity. The independence of the Latin American peoples also served for Spain to finally know what its true deed had been, what deeds worthy of memory and what enduring values it had been able to establish in a different world. For this reason, the value of independence is also significant for Spain. Only after it is possible to assess the contribution of civilization that its terrible American adventure had. There are those who say that with independence came a vast and reciprocal orphanhood, that America was left with independence and Spain was left with absolutism, that Spain was left with dispossession and we were left with oblivion. The truth is that Spain was disappearing as the protagonist of the great stage of history. It went in that century from being the first empire in the world to being one of the last countries in Europe, and the Latin American nations, after the lightning of its birth, which dazzled the world, which inscribed us in the legend of the centuries, which put Bolivar's statues in the squares of Cairo, next to the Alexander III Bridge in Paris and in New York's Central Park, entered in a tumult analogous to silence, which was in reality the silence of long gestations. Bolivar and his men knew what silence they were putting an end to, but they could not know how long the process of forming new stories would take. Generations often make mistakes in assessing their own achievements, because what they seek has to be within their lifetime. But the life of generations is counted by decades and the life of nations is counted by centuries. No one owns the ultimate consequences of their actions. Today, every day of the culture of our continent increases the importance of those precursors, because in matters of such magnitude, only history fully knows who acted with justice and who was wrong in the dramatic twists of fate. Spain believed that its admirable and lasting work in America had been the work of the conquerors, that insane adventure of domination with beasts and iron, one of the most colossal works of annihilation and intimidation by technique that the condition has produced. Human, a dazzling and self-sacrificing feat although minutely evil, which sowed pain and moral misery for centuries. He could not know that his true exploits, almost involuntary, had been others. One of the great fruits of the conquest has been miscegenation. It was achieved less by the recklessness of the conquerors than by naked human solitude, and its initial price would be secular isolation. Those knots of silence to which the horror of history subjects us and that later require divine energy to untie them and turn them into song. Novalis said that all language is deified. Perhaps there is no other adjective to describe what Juan de Castellanos and Rubén Darío, Alfonso Reyes and César Vallejo, José María Arguedas and Luis Pales Matos, Rómulo Gallegos and José Eustasio Rivera, Juan Rulfo and Gabriel García Márquez have achieved over time. Jorge Luis Borges and Pablo Neruda, that the word deified, the thread of blood that sings. A warrior adventure is not enough to sow a language in a territory. After 7 centuries of occupation, Spain did not end up speaking Arabic. China did not end up speaking English. India did not become a British playground, although the English language has remained alive in the hospitable world of Shiva and Vishnu. The adventure of Spain, precisely because it was not exhausted in that purely military aspect that so fascinated the Francoists, made available to the mestizo world one of the most complex languages of Europe, the direct daughter of Plato and Aeschylus, of Virgil and Lucretius, checkered Arabic, intricate by Islam and by the Kabbalah, which in Renaissance times received in one hand the algebras of Dante and the fountains of Petrarch, and in the other the pictures of the ancient memory of America. Right from the beginning it is possible to trace the way in which that language recognized the territory, tasted its places and customs, and dialogued with the indigenous languages far from orthodoxy, through the curious paths of poetry. There began a world whose fruits could not be seen then. There began a culture that we can now appreciate in its diversity and originality. Literature, art, and music already allow us to see the invisible. As Wallace Stevens deftly put it, the dress of a woman from Lhasa, instead, is an invisible element of that place made visible. For that enormous continental culture to find its affirmation and its song, that leap into the unknown that the epic generations of the early 19th century carried out was necessary. It is important to understand that when the liberators undertook their adventure they were reaping the fruits of European modernity. Their fight against Spain took place because they felt that Spain was not European enough, modern enough. Europe was no longer just the monarchy, it was the French Enlightenment, English empiricism, German rationalism, romanticism, the response of sensibility to these rational adventures. They were looking less for the American arcade than for the breath of the new times, and only in this way can the role played by Rousseau, Voltaire, and Humboldt in the gestation of the dream of independence be understood. When we began to need to break with Spain, France became the older sister of our cultural adventure. If the king began to make us uncomfortable, it was above all because of the example of France, and given that the king here had been more of a legend than a presence, no one resigned himself to inventing a king of flesh and blood in these lands. The idea of sovereignty of the people permeated this subordinate society for centuries, which finally wanted to stand on its own, abandon its ghostly condition. Our fight against Spain, because it took place under the glare of the French Revolution, gradually became a fight against the monarchy. But beyond freedom, the ideals of equality and fraternity, paradoxical and delusional in the France of 1789, seemed like true madness in our American societies subjected to Spanish power, because, as Baron Alejandro de Humboldt had very well warned at the beginning of the century, the colony left in these lands a system of hierarchies and stratifications so complex and disgraceful that it would be very difficult for people here to ever see themselves as fellow citizens. A few dreamers took our society's ambitions too far. Most of the leaders of independence had more moderate dreams. They wanted some autonomy under the power of the throne, or they wanted the king to come and rule their domains, as the Emperor of Portugal had been able to fix his royalty on the beaches of Rio de Janeiro, or they wanted us to find among our mestizo great men the one who could wear the diadem on his temples. There were even those who dreamed of importing some boy of royal blood so that he would resign himself to being king of these Morichales. But even the most ambitious, like Bolívar, could only know that something was beginning. The enigma of America exceeded the capacity of 18th century thought to encompass it. The Enlightenment, through Humboldt, was able to read the book of its nature with astonishment. Romanticism, with its thirst for action and its passion for freedom, could unravel other things. Bolívar, embodiment of the forces of his time, did more than liberate nations, he liberated unexpected historical forces. For this reason, when Borges said of Rubén Darío and the generation of modernists at the end of the 19th century that no one like them in our America deserved the name of liberators, he wanted to point out that the continent needed more than one liberation. So many things had been silenced, so many erased. We children of America had received such efficient orders not to look, not to listen, not to understand, not to feel, that even the greatest variety of birds in the world was resolved in our poetry into nightingales, little birds that did not come to us from the jungles but from mythology. America continued to be a hidden treasure for centuries, and only freedom allowed us to go on removing, from mythological tombs, those mud citadels, those heights of Machu Picchu, those Comalas, those Macondos, those deep rivers, those harps from the plain, those accordions of the coasts, those libraries of Babel, those jaguar skins with the writing of God that rest at the bottom of our oblivion. New versions of the world await in this mixed memory of Asians from 30,000 years ago, Europeans from 500 years ago, Africans from 400 years ago, merging into a nameless world. We still get up every day without knowing what revealing signs, what celestial maps are going to appear on those long stones on the riverbank, what golden civilizations are going to arise where the earth is removed to open a road, what music that will move the world are going to leave the workshop of that retired colonel who has dedicated himself to goldsmithing. America needed not only scientists and warriors, it needed travelers and sign readers, capable of listening to the language of the birds and the languages of the jungle. It is not enough that Humboldt, the wise friend, was able to see our mountains and our rivers. America needed to open in its own mud eyes to look at itself and ears to listen to itself. If the entire European pharmacy has sprung from the 10,000 varieties of plants that exist on that continent, the world is still waiting for the medical knowledge that rests on the 100,000 varieties of plants of equinoctial America. How much the sacred vines have taught the Amazon shamans, the 1,000 aesthetic adventures that await in the ritual arts of the native peoples, the poetry that must spring from the fusion of myths, the bewitched algebra that already stammers in the verses of Cesar Vallejo and Pablo Neruda. Campanella and Rousseau and Hölderlin still have to speak with the spirit of the Amazon. The world is only known by those who carefully travel it, and in our time travelers know less and less about the space they cross. One who passes in a plane at 800 km/h can feel little of the countries, for whom deserts and oceans are the same abstract thing 30,000 feet deep, for whom it is not possible to notice more differences than the vague shape of the mountains or the stain of the inland seas, for whom there are only the points of departure and arrival. Flying is little more than leafing through an atlas, although at least it allows you to touch the ends of the road. But those travelers from before traveled, to the rhythm of the horse and the wind, if not step by step, each rock of the Alps, each root of the forest, each fraction of mist of the high Andes, they drank all the breezes, they listened to all the birds, they had a relationship with the world that we can hardly imagine today. One of the customs of the continent has been to mark with plagues the places that Bolivar visited, the houses where he spent even one night, the banks of the rivers where he embarked, the places where the boys from the villages followed him, dragged by his conviction and for his star. In this, too, Humboldt had preceded the traveler Bolivar, with an even more question-filled gaze, and deserved the unique honor of leaving his name on mountains, plants, plains, lakes, and even on an ocean current. But Bolivar was not classifying leaves and flowers, nor describing the course of rivers, nor studying geological layers, but rather incorporating rivers and lakes, rocks and mountains, towns and jungles into a historical project. The initial scheme of the rebellion prepared for him the later scheme of the republics. America is, in its nature, a much vaster and more diverse continent than Europe. There are no true deserts or true forests in Europe, nothing comparable to the Amazon region, nothing comparable to the Argentine pampas, and nothing comparable to the Andes mountain range, with its cloud forests in the equinoctial region, its arid Peruvian heights, its immense abysses, its radiant plateaus, its high salt deserts and even its blue sea with islands 4,000 meters high. Europe is a continent on a human scale, which many travelers in antiquity traveled on foot, and which some still travel on foot, and where no matter how lost someone is, it is a few hours from some populated place, whereas, as Auden said, every American has seen with his own eyes lands practically untouched by history. It is in this world of ours where José Eustaquio Rivera can speak of those people who devoured the jungle, where Hernandez describes Cruz and Fierro erasing themselves in the limitless desert, where in Colombia 8 years of war by an entire state fails to rescue the captives of brutal guerrillas, where we are truly surrounded by immense oceans. In the voyages of the warriors of conquest, unknown worlds were described, as we noticed reading Juan de Castellanos, and they make us feel a planetary vertigo that can hardly be compared to the Mongol campaigns through the immensities of Asia, with a lesser presence of long and continuous civilizations. To follow Bolivar's route is to experience an even greater wonder. He got to know a good part of the American territory and its people with the precision and thoroughness with which a poet knows his language. Studying his life tends to be confused with a detailed geography lesson. Knowing him is not only knowing a man, it is above all knowing a world. He, who had the necessary resources, could have stayed in ancient and cultivated Europe. We know of his fascination with France, of his love for Paris, of his exalted journey through the Alps and valleys of Italy to the Roman countryside. He preferred to traverse America as no one had ever traversed it, and he preferred an even more complex feat, that of building America, advancing by awakening nations, amassing republics, sowing institutions, fight to give a place in the world to peoples who were just discovering themselves. Heir to a long tradition, it is said of Napoleon that, 2 miles from Boulogne, cornered by enemies, he dictated to his scribes point by point the campaign that would begin the next day, the plan for the march on Austria, as if he had all the maps before his eyes, with such incredible knowledge of cliffs, forests, plains, high passes, and canyons, and with such precision, including the dates of arrivals, that in the following days everyone was amazed at his knowledge of the scene where the war was being waged, and to see that the events were linking up, foreseen and punctual like a prophecy that is fulfilled. Bolivar had to learn everything for himself, and it is said that one night, after one of his many defeats, while fleeing through a thick jungle, his men began to hear him talk about the continental campaign that would lead him to liberate vast republics. I will free New Granada and then Ecuador. I will go to Peru and raise the flag of resurrection over the towers of Potosi. Everyone felt that madness had overtaken him, but in the following years they were amazed to see how the forecasts of that delirium were being fulfilled step by step. On the morning of November 27, 1820, accompanied by a squadron of hussars and 50 officers of his staff, clad in gala uniforms and with his chest heavy with medals, he entered the little town of Santa Ana, near of Trujillo, in Venezuela. General Pablo Murillo, general commander of the Spanish troops in America. He was a man of humble origins, but the exercise of arms had given him fame. Born 45 years ago in Fuente-Secas, in Zamora, Murillo, fighting against England, obtained the title of sergeant at Cape San Vicente, in the mythical Battle of Trafalgar, which endures in Browning's verses, rose to lieutenant of infantry at the Battle of Bailén against France. He became a colonel defeating the Napoleonic troops in Vigo, joined the English army of the Duke of Wellington. He was promoted to field marshal in 1813, and reached the rank of lieutenant general of the Spanish troops in the Battle of Vitoria, which claimed 8,000 casualties between dead and wounded, and 2,000 prisoners, to the imperial army, which forced Napoleon to return the crown to the Bourbons, forced the definitive withdrawal of the French troops and decided the independence from Spain. A poorly born soldier had given a king back his kingdom. Ferdinand VII took longer to settle back on the throne than to give Murillo the order to recover the American colonies for Spain, emancipated 5 years earlier. With 58 ships, among which the San Pedro de Alcantara stood out, an imposing ship with 74 cannons, and at the head of 12,000 men, the general undertook the reconquest. While Bolívar jumped from island to island looking for his light and time, Murillo laid siege to Cartagena de Indias for 4 months. The city finally had to open its doors after seeing 300 of its children die of hunger and plague in a single day, and the troops of Spain advanced victoriously and without mercy, putting all the inhabitants of the town to death. Boca Chica. Later, in Santa Fe de Bogotá, the peacemaker had viciously sacrificed the entire generation of intellectuals and wise men who supported the insurrection, among whom Francisco José de Caldas, friend and collaborator of Humboldt during his trip through South America, stood out. Faced with someone who tried to dissuade him from the crime, Murillo forever stained his own memory and that of his country, authorizing the execution with this brutal argument: Spain does not need wise men. All these things inclined the Americans to support the revolutionary troops to the end, and among the crimes of the occupation army there was one that caused singular repugnance: the sacrifice of the president of New Granada, Camilo Torres, shot and beheaded, whose remains they were exhibited to the horror of passers-by under the pecking of vultures. Now 5 years had passed since the War of Reconquest, and Spain, less and less sure of its victory and the preservation of its empire, had agreed to sign an armistice. After 5 years of bloodshed against the American rebels, between muddy battles and deadly ambushes, sleeplessness and carnage, atrocity and looting, on this occasion, in Santa Ana, Murillo did not come to face his bitter enemies again, but to see in person, for the first time in his life, the leader of that rebellion. Bolívar was becoming a legend. The aristocrat who had given his fortune, one of the largest in America, in the struggle for independence, that he had been defeated again and again and again, expelled towards New Granada, towards Jamaica, towards Haiti, by forces immensely superior in men and supplies to those of his Cumana guerrillas, his horsemen from the plains and his Indian troops and of shirtless and barefoot Zambos, he had risen again from all those defeats, like the giant that recovered his strength when he fell, in contact with his Mother Earth. He had fought with one arm against the Spanish power and with the other against the disorder and incredulity of his own men, carrying on his lips an eloquent and energetic speech, to convince the Americans that it was possible to defeat the enormous and omnipresent enemy. He had fought alone for union, for faith, for victory, convinced that America had to be free, that on the soil of South America, subjected to servitude and slavery for 3 centuries, it was possible to found republics like that at that time they were making their way with cannon fire and bayonet blows on the soil of Europe. He had declared a fierce war to the death to respond to the enemy's carnage. He had liberated the Orinoco, dragging brigades of adversaries towards the swamps, where they were devoured by nature, and as soon as he managed to subject the Venezuelan prairies to his command, he had urgently summoned in Angostura to a Congress of Deputies that would assume power, dictate the constitution and subject to an unappealable law all those troops hitherto dragged into barbarism by the whirlwind of war. Until the Congress of Angostura, in 1818, Bolívar was seen by much of the world with the colors with which the Spanish crown had painted him, a bloodthirsty guerrilla in command of a troop of bestial men, who was sowing terror in wild lands, fighting civilization, profaning the church and committing all kinds of crimes. This decision to invoke the law, to dictate the constitution, to subject the warriors to strict legality, and the additional gesture of renouncing his power and putting everything in the hands of the representatives of the community, that gesture that revealed in him a statesman and a man of principles and ideals, he earned the admiration of Europe, and now English and Irish brigades were militating under his command, as well as young intellectuals from France and England who knew each other. In the presence of one of the most remarkable of his time. He had built his adventure with a heart divided between admiration for the talent and rejection for the arrogance of Bonaparte, who at that time, imprisoned and exiled on a remote island, was deciphering in the clouds, alone, the secret of his lost empire. At the head of his troops, Bolívar had just accomplished the most audacious and definitive feat of his campaigns, the unexpected passage of the Andes through inclement gorges, through moors where dozens of his poor soldiers died, through swamps that they had to cross entire days with the waist deep in water, taking more care of the weapons on top than the bodies in the wet and mud, to hit the Spaniards by surprise precisely from the flank from which they would never have expected an attack, and liberate, in a campaign so brief and blinding as lightning, the central territory of New Granada. This November morning was the first meeting of the two bitter adversaries, and Murillo was impatiently waiting to see Bolívar and his escort arrive. They finally appeared in the distance, and Murillo's first surprise was that his enemy did not come guarded by numerous troops but was accompanied by only 10 officers. "I thought my guardhouse too small," he said afterwards, "to venture so far, but my old enemy surpassed me in magnanimity." But Murillo's greatest surprise, who immediately withdrew the squadron of hussars so that it would not be thought that he mistrusted, was not the small escort but the escort himself. It took him a while to understand that Bolívar was not one of the uniformed officers who came in the procession, but that little man in a blue jacket and campaign hat who rode through them on a mule, without any indication of his rank. Bolívar had studied everything, and when he made the decision to go with his few officers, he had already been informed of the grandeur and pomp of his adversary's procession. He must have remembered that day at Montesquiaro, in 1805, when what impressed him most about Napoleon was the simplicity of his appearance, the cape without insignia and the hat without ornaments, amid the cloud of splendors of his staff. Murillo finally understood, that little man was Bolívar. Then they got off their mounts and hugged each other. The first part of the dialogue had been completed without saying a single word. After the crossing of the Andes, when Bolívar surprised the Spanish and inflicted 2 successive defeats on them, at the Pantano de Vargas and at the Puente de Boyaca, the course of the war had changed. The next day, as Bolívar and his generals entered Bogotá victoriously, Murillo's army was already moving on the defensive, and it was not long before an armistice was proposed. That night in Santa Anna, the two enemies not only exchanged prisoners and gave each other the honors required by tactics, but also slept under the same roof, as proof of their trust. Interestingly, Murillo, the son of the people, represented there all the power of Spanish royalty, and Bolívar, the man of aristocratic birth, the shirtless rebels of the colonies. But in this episode, Murillo, who had just defeated Napoleon, restored the monarchy and been the great protagonist of the resurgence of the Spanish monarchy, was going down in history. Bolívar, who had come from disasters and failures on the coasts and in the swamps, and who had defeated the royal armies, well armed and well supplied, with a famished army of shadows, was entering the legend. Even more, without anyone noticing, except surely Bolívar, whose eyes saw further, Murillo's star was fading, to the point that the Spanish general withdrew almost immediately, leaving his subordinates unaware of the dance of the defeat, while the historical halo of Bolívar, which was growing, would not be extinguished for centuries. They seemed to be on equal terms, but after that interview, Murillo became a shadow, a relic of history, and Bolívar began to climb the slopes of myth. The armistice meant for Bolívar to be recognized for the first time as head of state by the Spanish crown. When the ceasefire broke down a few months later, the fortunes of the war for independence had definitely tipped in the direction of the Americans. Now Bolívar is in the south, crossing the Pacha Canyon. He goes with his troops to liberate Quito. He knows that he is closer than ever to crowning his dream of waving the flags of freedom in Lima and Potosí. But how to realize the harsh reality of his days? This is what we find in one of his letters to Santander. First, the unavoidable mention of how the territory cowers or discourages soldiers. There isn't a day when the vanguard division alone doesn't desert 8 or 10 men. Against whom is the war? The enemies are there, on the other side of the canyon, in Juanambu and Pasto, but a more dangerous enemy is invading the troops, smallpox. We have 3 columns that don't mount 2,500 men in one day, because each of them sends 20 or 30 men to the hospital every day. Fortitude is needed to control oneself and maintain order and discipline when an army that awaits many days of marching and fighting is decimated as follows. General Torres has lost 170 men between dead, deserters and sick, and there are no more. What 2 days? In a serene voice, in which a background of desperation is felt, he asks for reinforcements. The artillery battalion, with how many recruits and veterans there are in that capital, and with 30,000 or 40,000 pesos that should leave the second day after Lara arrived at Bogotá. And where should the resources come from? The imperious war imposes its harsh logic, one-eyed or right, this must be done without remedy. But the general does not make abstract requests, he knows that he must go into detail. The whole of 2,000 men and 30,000 pesos more, all driven quickly, and with espadrilles, with cartridge belts, if any, 18-pound caliber cartridges, caps for recruits, and even a blanket dress. Something serious has happened with recent shipments, because he adds, if there are good sparkstones, let them come, because the ones they have sent are useless. And one more sentence, to show how serious the situation is, this army cannot live here for a month, because it is dying of disease and hunger. In fact, 2,000 more men would go to the hospital, and 2,000 sick people eat and spend more than 4,000 good. But even more dynamic is the general's awareness that not only the strategy of the war and the leadership of the troops depend on him, but also the solution of all the practical minutiae. The enumeration that he makes, in the form of a litany and a complaint, is very expressive. If he is not there, they will not send the troops of the Tiradores battalion from Magdalena. If he is not there, the soldiers have their feet shattered for lack of espadrilles. If he is not there, no one thinks of sending shoelaces to uncover the ears of the rifles, without which there is no combat. If he is not there, no one makes the laces that are missing. If he is not there, they do not undo the defective cartridges to make them again. Only he manages to solve everything. And if he is not there, Montilla sends rifles of one caliber and ammunition of another. On top of that, he has to ponder night and day, constantly thinking about the war that is coming his way. It was the harsh war of Pacha, which culminated in the battles of Juanambu and Bombona, less showy and glorious than the one Sucre had just won on the slopes of Pichincha, but thoroughly exhausting due to the difficulty of the terrain and the adversity of the enemy. But on the other side of that line of shadow, something that we can only name with the word glory was waiting for Bolívar. Not only the liberation of Ecuador, its annexation to the Gran Colombia project, the reception in Guayaquil, the triumphal march on the city of Quito, the enthusiasm of the multitudes in a beautiful and exuberant country, the gallant parties, the horizons opening towards the south, the intoxication of the light on the mountains of the Inca, but the 2 events that on the eve of his 40 years put on Bolívar's forehead the certainty not of a partial triumph but of having achieved a dream that he had cherished since the end of his adolescence. Despite the solemnity of the setting and the romance of the moment, the intoxicating thing was not swearing in Rome with sword raised not to give rest to his arm until he had liberated a world. The intoxicating thing is that this man has been granted the privilege, not obtained by luck but conquered by patience, obstinacy, will, rigor and audacity, of fulfilling that oath, of seeing one day a free world before their eyes, open to all the challenges of the future. It doesn't matter what comes after, the ingratitude, the betrayal, the failure. At this moment, two great rewards still await him for his dogged effort. The first, planned and carefully prepared, will be the interview in Guayaquil with General José de San Martín, who will decide the command over all the troops on the continent, who will decide who has the privilege of being the architect of the great continental victory. The Wintic history is going to carry that name to the farthest reaches of America. The other will be a gift of chance, unless we find the name of the Numen that grants those gifts, the encounter with Manuela Sáenz, who is preparing on a balcony in Quito to throw a crown in her path. At the two ends of the continent, Bolívar and San Martín represented the Creole aristocracy of the provinces least served by Spain. Both were in Madrid at the same time, and if Bolívar enjoyed the proximity of the court, San Martín was a proud part of the Spanish army. Both had their brush with Napoleonic power. Bolívar, in the tumult of that day of the enthronement, among the crowds of Paris, San Martín, facing his armies as a soldier of the Spanish army. Their destinies had already begun to differ irremediably. San Martín had seen the crowds lynch a commander and was marked by a certain mistrust of civil unrest. Bolívar kept an epic impression of the crowds celebrating the glory of the hero. It could be said that San Martín, like Miranda, was a soldier trained in Europe. Bolívar was also a tribune, someone who knew how to turn to the people when history required it. A parallel feature is that San Martín undertook the journey to Chile, like Bolívar to Venezuela, contrary to the will of his superiors. Both knew that the fight had to be continental, that a single South American country in the power of Spain meant an eternal danger for all the others. The freedom of America required the subjugation of the royalist minorities, their defeat, or their expulsion. And both knew that the last stronghold of Spain would be Peru. The Iberian sun had risen in Cajamarca, and apparently it would have to eclipse itself there, because the opulent viceroyalty not only sent considerable wealth to the crown but had also reproduced in the mountains the splendor of the Austrians and the Bourbons. The gazes of the two condors were directed over the mountains to the old peaks of the Inca. From the south and from the north the armies converged towards those heights where the king's flag was hoisted and where the Spanish power exhibited its firmness between the blowing of the Indian flutes and the peaceful ruminating of llamas and alpacas. And the two storms advanced from the north and south towards the Peruvian mountains. Bolívar and San Martín knew that only when the viceroys of Lima were defeated and expelled from the Peruvian highlands, could the new nations feel masters of America. For this, the two assumed the enormous challenge of crossing the mountain range with their liberating troops. The crossing was perhaps more arduous for the Argentine regiments, because the mountain range that separates Chile is almost impregnable. They passed through gorges 5,000 meters high, and only the strength and good supply of the troops allowed them to reach the Chilean coast. 2 years later Bolívar crossed the northern Andes, with much more destitute troops, almost a parade of ghosts that could be illustrated with details of the triumph of death, by Peter Brueghel. There are historical events that can only be fully named beyond historiography and the logic of language. Men and women, soldiers and captains, politicians and thinkers, beasts and weapons, but also bloody ghosts, nameless gods, talismans, spells, the 900 roses of myth participate in them. That swarm that was forming around the Peruvian fortress would be the last assault to conquer a face in the multitude of the human, a voice of its own in the clamor of history. To the liberation of Argentina corresponded the liberation of the plains of the Orinoco, to the liberation of Chile, after the impressive passage of the Andes, the liberation of New Granada, to the liberation of Uruguay, the liberation of Quito. To Carabobo, Boyaca and Pichincha corresponded Tucumán, Chacabuco and Maipú. After San Martin entered the viceroyalty and fought the first battles, he had obtained the title of Protector of Peru, and then the time came for the meeting between the two armies and the two chiefs. Both knew that in a war cause, two conflicting chiefs are equivalent to civil war. One of the two had to command the armies of the entire continent, and Bolívar and San Martin met in Guayaquil on July 26, 1822. From that meeting without witnesses, from that meeting to which the world was not invited, Bolívar he came out as the head of the final charge against Spain. Then came the unification of the continental troops under the sole command of Bolívar, the triumph of the patriots in Junin, resplendent as a dream, and the triumph of Sucre in Ayacucho. A continent celebrated those who had been able to achieve the impossible. But what was at the center of that surge, both historical and mythological, fits more in a poem like Alturas de Machu Picchu, by Pablo Neruda, than in a chronicle. So on the ladder of earth I have climbed, among the atrocious tangle of the lost jungles. To you, Machu Picchu, high city of scaling stones, finally abode of the terrestrial. He did not hide in the sleeping garments. In you, like two parallel lines, the cradle of lightning and man, they swayed in a wind of thorns. Mother of stone, foam of the condors, high reef of the human aurora, lost shovel in the first arena. This was the abode, this is the place. Here the broad grains of corn rose, and they came down again like red hail. Here the golden thread came out of the vicuna, to dress the loves, the tombs, the mothers, the king, the prayers, the warriors. Here the feet of man rested at night next to the feet of the eagle, in the high carnivorous dens, and at dawn they stepped on the rarefied fog with the feet of thunder, and touched the earth and the stones until they recognized them in the night or death. I look at the clothes and the hands, the vestige of water in the hollow sound, the wall softened by the touch of a face. Who looked with my eyes at the terrestrial lamps, who oiled the disappeared wood with my hands, because everything, clothing, skin, vessels, words, wine, bread, left, fell to earth. And the air entered with fingers of orange blossom over all the sleepers. 1,000 years of air, months, weeks of air, of blue wind, of iron mountain range, that were like soft hurricanes of steps, polishing the solitary enclosure of the stone. Because it is true that what they were looking for was both in the misty settings of history and in the symbolic spaces of legend, it was the resolution of a cosmic drama. Those liberators were not only looking for victory over a despot or an invader, they were looking for themselves in the face of America. The possibility of their triumph was the possibility of their own existence. Conquering the future was also finally conquering memory. Glory came and, with it, a secret defeat. Because we all know that from the moment Bolívar triumphed, he began to get in the way everywhere. The star of the republics did not allow the sun of the Continental Union to rise. Many have judged that fact as a betrayal of the generals to their own boss. They feel that Bolívar was betrayed by men far less great than he. Perhaps the truth is slightly different. There is no doubt that they did not understand it, but one would have to ask if they were in a position to understand it. He was right. Without the Continental Union, the new nations would be abandoned to their fate, at the mercy of the voracity of the world market, with no real capacity for negotiation. But it was early in the world for the project of a continental union. Not even Europe dreamed of it, where nations were already formed, possessed strong identities and a long cultural tradition. Sometimes we wonder if the mere will to unite is enough to achieve it, or if only great tragedies, such as the Second World War, manage to move peoples towards a union that guarantees their survival. The generals, for petty reasons, for naive idealism, for a thirst for power, wanted nations, and they saw as something undesirable the union that Bolívar continued to preach more and more in vain, more and more tormented by the evidence of a fragmentation that for him was equivalent to a vast and hopeless shipwreck. It seemed that in a way his triumph had been his failure. While the enemy was present, while Spain rose up against everyone, the union was possible, As soon as Spain retreated and began to flee, the union did not seem necessary to more than 2 men, Bolívar and Sucre, and the factions found a way to get rid of them, giving them to die the bullets of Baruicos and the poisons of disappointment. And yet, we all know that Bolívar was not defeated. The day after his death, everyone knew that he had been the greatest thing our land had ever seen. Everyone turned him into a marble or bronze instrument to strengthen his politics. Everyone invoked his name and lamented, not always falsely, having been ungrateful to him. The tasks that he outlined for the continent rose again as inescapable duties, not because he had proposed them but because they were necessities of history, tasks that each decade made a little more evident. 2 centuries have passed. Little, for the perspective of the nations, too much for the lives of individuals. The age of warriors is passing, the age of mere politicians is passing. Thinkers and statesmen are becoming more and more necessary. And it becomes more and more necessary to value that human side, contradictory, passionate, sensitive, lucid, which is the one we have least appreciated about our founders. That complexity that nothing values as much as art. Anyone who aspires to feel the proximity of a historical figure, who wants to have the feeling that he has come to know him or experience what those who once saw him before, soon understands that it is not the accumulation of data, the abundance of information, which makes us feel like we know someone. Of many of our friends we ignore a good part of the circumstances of their lives, many experiences of our own life tend to be forgotten, and other people remember things we did and forget. Every writer knows the curious experience of finding in his notes facts that would have disappeared had he not recorded them in words. That is why Whitman asked before a biography, "Is this the life of a man?" If we know anything about Shakespeare, it is that his life must have had very little resemblance to what Victor Hugo tells us in the excellent and fantastic book he wrote about him. Sometimes a phrase or an anecdote make a character better known than 1,000 pages of a biography. And that is why James Boswell's life of Dr. Samuel Johnson is such a high monument to human memory, because of its number of circumstantial features, because of its abundance of vivid examples of personal tone and style. And that is why the book that Peru de Lacroix, the confidant of the Liberator, wrote in Bucaramanga, while they waited for the result, which Bolívar knew was disastrous, of the Ocana Convention, is one of the documents that best allows us to know Bolívar. Lacroix's Peru, like Boswell with Johnson, talked with the Liberator every day, had lunch or dinner with him, went horseback riding around the town, played trezolo with him until midnight, saw him answer letters and attend visits, and then he ran to his room to write down everything that Bolívar had said, so that we have the intense sensation that we have just heard him speak. His words keep a moving closeness. In that lucky book we also find, everywhere, powerful traits of his personality. Bolívar is speaking in the next room, it is the sensation that the pages of Peru by Lacroix leave us. From them we know of his extraordinarily competitive temperament, how one day he had his hands tied to go swimming, in competition with Colonel Martel, down the Orinoco, to some gunboats anchored 150 meters away, just because Martel had grown proud of himself. Swim better than everyone in the troop. As he recounts it, Bolívar himself admits that this occurrence would seem like something out of a madman, although he does not think he is. It served the multiple purpose of displaying his energy, rivaling others, testing his physical endurance, displaying his skill, and fueling his legend. He is aware that that competition was an extraordinary event, that highlighted his tenacity and the strength of his will, and that although he sought to reaffirm his superior position in the army, at least he did not do so through the easy path of authority and imposition, but exposing himself to extreme danger. He liked to star in those showy events and then he was pleased to tell them. That time he couldn't stop General Ibarra, his aide-de-camp, from putting 2 good swimmers in the river to help him in an emergency, but there was no need for them anyway. Martel won the competition by a few meters. His interest in all the men in his troop is remarkable. He asks that they invite to his table, already as President of the Republic, a young officer without civil customs, just to help his training. Speaking of the young aide-de-camp Wilson, Bolivar allows himself to theorize about education, and says that it has at least three moments: that which parents give us, that which teachers give us, and that of the world. Part of this third education was the need to spend some time in the schools of hardship, of adversity, and even of misery. To hear him talk about his men is to notice his continuous exercise of observation and reflection on human beings. His description of his generals is vivid and very memorable. He lists their strengths and weaknesses, makes us feel that he knows exactly what to expect from them, the missions he can give each one. He knows and, when necessary, accepts the incorrigible defects of men whose talents or merits are indispensable to the cause of the revolution. We try to find Bolivar and sometimes we feel that everything is left out. The detailed harshness of his campaigns, his relationship with the generals, his precise knowledge of each of them. De Pise, for example, that reckless, intuitive and ferocious plainsman who would demand an entire painting just for himself. That violent man, emerged from the earth, without civil customs, and yet full of talents and learning ability. It is amazing that one of the most moving moments for its human weight in this story is found precisely in the environment of Pise, who seems the rudest of men. But it is good to understand the intricacies of reality in every inch of the territory, in every minute of history. Pise lived a kind of intoxication with blood and violence. In the midst of battles he entered a kind of frenzy, which made him convulse and even foam at the mouth, and even made him fall off his horse in the middle of combat. Behind him was a formidable Negro who was his servant and also his jealous protector. One of the tasks of this man was to pick up Pise when he fell in battle, and save him from the danger of being trampled by horses. At some point during the wars in Venezuela, the huge black man was riding in the vanguard of the army, and Pise was far behind. Suddenly the general saw his servant riding towards him, and asked him loudly if he had lost heart in the fight. "No," replied the man, who was bleeding, "I have come to say goodbye." Mortally wounded, all the loyal man did was desperately ride to his friend, just to bid him farewell. Or talk about the complex relationship with Santander, in whom Bolivar discovered early on a brave soldier but also a methodical man and an excellent administrator, although possessed by an almost sickly sense of dignity, which made him abound in arguments and minutiae in defense of his tarnished honor. More important than this extreme susceptibility was his loyalty in responding to his duties, and Bolivar saw in him the man who should be the provider of resources for the troops from the liberated regions. Santander, flattered by the title of vice president and fascinated by Republican rituals, perhaps took too seriously the illusion that they already had a republic in their hands, when in reality the capital of New Granada was the center of a clear corridor of enemies that would only be safe when the rest of the territory had been liberated. No one can doubt the responsibility with which, in the early days, Santander zealously and efficiently provided for the needs of the army, while Bolivar advanced southward amid 1,000 hardships. Gradually he began to forget that those troops that were more and more distant, more and more lost in wars that already seemed unrelated, were the true support of his power, of the legitimacy of his government and of the continuity of his republican project, and he began to see them as an obstacle to the consolidation of institutions. The laws had been born from the War of Freedom. Santander soon began to see that war, still unfinished, as a violation of legality, imposed restrictions on Bolivar, required him to adhere to regulations that at the time were mere formalities, not to cross the borders without having been authorized by legislators who were unaware the scene of the war and were unaware of its vicissitudes. The correspondence between the two is a disturbing lesson in the conflict between the concrete needs of reality and the abstract fictions of a legality that, oblivious to the circumstances, gradually becomes an obstacle to action. Everything appears to us as a motley succession of novels. Because even venerating that final trip down the river that Garcia Marquez reinvented, with the tears of the last star on the big drums of San Pedro Alejandrino, a single novel may not be enough. Isn't the conflict between Bolivar and Miranda quite a novel, between the almost European general with grey temples who idealized and lost his American homeland and the impatient warrior who learned through defeat how to invent republics in the equinoctial jungle? That story that began with admiration and long talks and patriotic parades and ended in rivalry, discord, despair, and failure? Or that lightning campaign along the Magdalena, ridding the river of enemies, under the bustle of the parrots, amid the siege of alligators, living in each port the ravings of a new love? Or that landing, coming from Haiti, with the supplies that President Pétion gave him, with his heart ordering him to advance west, to liberate Caracas again, and reason demanding that he launch the war for the eastern region, that he entered through the Orinoco towards the heart of the plains, in successive conflicts and alliances with Moreno and Bermudez and PR, the other guerrilla chiefs? Or the alliance with Pease, without which he would not have been able to found the republic in Angostura, and those campaigns through the open prairies, where his galloping troops made themselves pursued by the adversary and at the last moment they disappeared, leaving the enemies at the mercy of the enemy? Of the swamps? And who would not be tempted to build a portrait of Bolívar in light of the intense relationship he had with others? Contrast the version of his nurse Hippolyta with the one that his tutors could give us, or with the memory that King Ferdinand VII would keep of him and his children's games. Contrast the memories of his teacher Simon Rodriguez with the memory that Baron Alejandro de Humboldt kept of him after his salon dialogues in Paris and his cavalcades around Rome. Overlay the image of the insubordinate Bolívar, which Francisco de Miranda took to his grave, the image of the Bolívar capable of signing the sentence of a comrade in arms, which PR would carry in his mind when, saluting the flag blurred by tears, he received the discharge of the rifle. Bolívar's life confronts us with a deep gallery of mythical couples, Bolívar and Rodriguez, or Rousseau's lesson, Bolívar and Humboldt, or the new discovery of America, Bolívar and Miranda, or the conflict between the dream of liberating a world and the need to invent it, Bolívar and PR, or the ghost of racial wars, Bolívar and Pease, or the difficulty of modeling American clay, Bolívar and Santander, or the insoluble conflicts of a civility born of war, Bolívar and San Martín, or the enigmas of the will to power, Bolívar and Sucre, or the brotherhood of spirits, Bolívar and Murillo, or the metamorphoses of war. Masser says that Bolívar's face had an extraordinary expressiveness and changed to the rhythm of his emotions with impressive rapidity. Perhaps that explains why the pictures we have of him, although they maintain some basic features, the width of the forehead, the depth of the eyes, the frontal baldness, the straight nose, the wide upper lip, the pronounced lower lip, or the way the cheekbones stand out on the face always seem to put us in the presence of someone slightly different. The famous Bolton archive, which contains portraits from early youth, sometimes shows us beings that do not resemble each other. The paintings of childhood and adolescence seem to belong to another person. But it is that the melancholy of the early days and the idealism of the latter were replaced in that spirit by more earthly concerns, and although the dreamer and the idealist never disappeared, the features that betray firmness and severity, audacity and irony, the frontal wrinkles from excessive worry, the lateral wrinkles from his outbursts of anger or joy, and the dark circles under his eyes from the long vigils, were taking their place on that face that the day's work deeply. Bolívar still escapes our frames, just as he always somehow escaped his painters, who could only capture one facet of that stormy and changing face, just as he has escaped the poets, who since the time of Almeida have been desperate to capture Bolívar in its tropes and its hendecasyllables. Neither Almeida, nor Silva, nor Caro, managed to make Bolívar live in their verses. Perhaps the mysterious verses that Hölderlin dedicated to Napoleon would also suit Bolívar. He does not live or endure in the poem. It lives and lasts in the world. In prose, Garcia Marquez voluntarily chose the Bolívar of defeat, seen in the colors of sunset, with the nuances of disappointment, already back from all things. It certainly caught him, although leaving out his mysterious childhood, his tormented adolescence, his battles, his triumphs, his intimacy with power and his excessive campaigns. Bolívar enthusiasts want to know everything. How many kilometers he traveled, how many battles he fought, how many women his embrace reached. How many letters did he dictate, how many proclamations, how many speeches. An attempt will also be made to recount his books, and that of his horses, although it is better to imagine him on these crests of the Andes on a mule, as Napoleon himself went through the Alps. And you also have to think about how many battles he lost as an apprentice of war, or how much was the fortune he gave for America, a man like him, so selfless, that he was always capable of giving all he had. And the mention of his aristocratic habits, the shirts, the suits, the coats, the boots, the handkerchiefs, the cologne. When we read his letters we are amazed at the thoroughness of his memory, his knowledge of men, his awareness of the territory, and the constant mention of quantities of mules and horseshoes, weapons, and uniforms. How to forget his taste for ceremonies and his clear will to feed legends. How after the Battle of Barbula he kept the heart of Atanasio Girardot in a golden urn to take it to the Pantheon in Caracas, how he wanted to wear the simplest attire for his meeting with Murillo. There are so many things we want to see. How was the crown that Manuela Sáenz threw at him from the balcony in Quito, that crown that did not fall at the feet of his horse, as she wanted, but on the general's own chest bathed in flowers, who he raised his head and saw her, still with outstretched arms, on the balcony, or how was that first dialogue between the two, that night, to the rhythm of the waltzes of that time, when he told her that if his armies had her aim, the Spaniards would already be defeated, or how the street was, much deeper than now, under the window through which he had to jump to escape the fury of the conspirators. Not everything is mentioned by his biographers, but the books take care of everything, the entire libraries that have been written about him, and those that will be written in the future, his several daily baths, his swords, his books of verses, how he danced the entire night after the interview in Guayaquil, perhaps the frenzied dance of victory, while San Martin looked alone at the still sea from the prow of his ship. Or that habit of seducing women by dazzling them with poems, and his surprise that this woman from Quito he had just met was able to finish, in English or French, the verses that he began to quote. Who will have the inventory of his illnesses, the memory of his courage in battle, of his notorious incapacity for fear, of his respect for rituals, which made him judiciously attend Mass even though his heart was agnostic? And there is also his inflexible sense of justice that made him so severe, especially in public affairs, his literary style, which in his proclamations and letters is full of originality, the height and elegance of his thought, his tendency to examine and criticize himself, so noticeable when, for example, he would fly into a rage playing triplet, and spend the rest of the night trying to understand why he, who was so selfless, so profligate, would fly into a rage over some almost symbolic material losses, to come to the conclusion that it was not the material fact of losing money but wounded pride that infuriated him. Or the mystery of that vital energy that led him to ride early, to always leave his riding companions behind, to endure endless crossings, to greet combat with frantic emotion, to live through battles with a kind of lucid intoxication and still have enough strength for the dance and for the long battles of love. The multiple secret of the seduction of his language his ideas were never common, says Peru de la Croix which left his memory scattered in 1,000 ways through the leagues of his homeland and through the years of its history. And alongside all of this, the necessary enumeration of his defects, anger, competitiveness, the need to always be first, the extreme firmness of his convictions, the excessive military spirit, the ambition for command and glory, and the how his biographers make us feel that all his defects were almost as necessary as his virtues, because a life is an inextricable fabric that perhaps can only be understood as a whole, and some things require the others to form their network of light and shadow. Only the fullness of its results allows us to ultimately value a destination. For this reason, when in the invisible courts of history someone asks what the value of Bolívar is, someone will be able to show the foundation of 5 republics, the proposal that millions of human beings be masters of their destiny and cease to be servants of the crowns. European, the tireless struggle of a generation for the freedom of a continent, and each one of us will be able to decide in his heart what is the value of these things and what heaven they deserve. So astonishing and new had these events been, fulfilled in 20 years, that the legend of Bolivar seized the dreams of a generation of Europeans from afar, and in Italy, in the circles of the Carbonari, the poet George Gordon Byron only he talked about his plan to travel to South America and enter as a soldier, under the command of Bolivar, in the struggle for the liberation of Colombia. Sufficient proof of the sparks that the liberator ignited in those spirits is that, when Shelley and Byron bought their ships in Italy to navigate the Mediterranean, while Shelley called his Ariel, in memory of the musical spirit of the tempest, Byron put in the prow of his the name that illuminated his thoughts, Bolivar. André Maurois has told us these things in his magnificent biography of Byron. There we are surprised by the closeness of Byron's spirit to Bolivar's, and the way in which the passions that Bolivar was able to redeem or sublimate through history kept Byron for a long time withdrawn into an inner drama. We see a being that advances full of bold and theatrical gestures, and retreats full of nightmares and remorse, a dreamy Don Juan, seducer of girls and philosophers, luxurious and sensitive, who has not quite found his destiny in the world, and is only saved by poetry. Byron had talked about nothing so much in Italy as about the imminence of his American adventure. But one day he received the news that Bolivar had triumphed in America and his armies had expelled Spanish power. At the same moment the insurrection of the Greeks broke out against the Turkish domination, and Byron, who was not in vain a passionate reader of Goethe, a Faustian creature, a romantic full of fascination for the world of the Mediterranean, the next day he made the decision to join the rebel troops and dedicate his fortune and his courage to fight for the freedom of Greece. He recruited the troops himself, he designed the uniforms himself. Months later he died of fever in the Missolonghi swamps and, as in a story by Borges, he could well have dreamed in his fever that he was dying in the Orinoco swamps or in the Inca mountains, fighting for the same cause, for the exalted dream of liberty and the Republic. Although statues would no longer stand in his memory in the plazas of South America, his admiration for Bolivar had been a sign of that passionate generation. Some time later Bertrand Russell would say that the highest moment of European Romanticism had not been a poem, nor a canvas, nor a symphony, but the death of Byron in Missolonghi fighting for the freedom of Greece, and it became visible to us, in the background of that romantic painting, as in a canvas by Caspar David Friedrich, the dot silhouette of a man outlined on the mountains of America. It was enough for Bolivar to die for the continent to wake up paved with its statues. No modern hero, Masseur says, has been more exalted in stone and bronze. But at the same time there was talk everywhere of the betrayal of their generals. The man who had led Hispanic America to emancipation, who with his struggle and with his thought had shaped the nations, who united and led the armies that expelled Spain, at the end of his life seems to us surrounded by the hatred of the republics. His own generals rose against him. Venezuela, in the power of peace, had prohibited entry, Peru had rejected it, after declaring war on Colombia, Bogota had expelled him. The picture of a man who awakens a world to be fought by it in the end, the image of the necromancer who engenders a creature that ultimately rebels against its creator, are metaphors that strike us as we see this man who unleashes so many forces and ended up upset by them. But could it be otherwise? The genuine proof that the world invented by Bolivar was an autonomous world perhaps lies in that rebellion, in the ability to reject the father, in that belief that so many had then that they could do without the teacher and the boss. That is why his destiny is so paradoxical and so imprecise to speak of his defeat. Bolivar understood that to expel Spain it was necessary to unite the entire continent. Brothered by the enemy, the South Americans made the greatest efforts and accomplished great deeds. But Bolivar wanted something more, that this union achieved by necessity would last forever and guarantee a new place in history for the newly liberated nations. Dispersed and lost in an uncontrollable nature, countries could disappear from the horizon of history, their adventure of freedom could shipwreck in anarchy or isolation, they could all be devoured by the great sharks of the world market. But only he understood that. Except for Sucre, perhaps, his generals were barely capable of conceiving the dream of republics, each wanted a modest homeland, the size of his ability or his ambition, and had all sorts of little purposes for it. Inventing republics with impeccable legislation, with little schools decorated in the French style, and uniformed children going every morning to the republican factories, to receive their portion of civility and legality. All the naive dream of adolescent republics. They wanted to forget about the war and saw in the merger with their neighbors the threat of great discord. So they locked themselves in their borders, half artificial and half natural. The dream was far in the future. Nobody like Bolívar to illustrate the much later thesis of Sigmund Freud about those who fail when they succeed. The day after his great victory, nobody wanted to know anything about him, nobody was interested in his dream. Once the Spaniards had been expelled, the Continental Union no longer seemed necessary, and no one had ears for the speech of this man who had conceived independence only as a step on the way to building a great nation. There are those who think that small nations are much more desirable and comfortable, there are those who mistrust the great federations and the hegemonic voracity of empires. But when those empires exist, isolated nations need a lot of character and a lot of internal cohesion so as not to be betrayed by the most ambitious of their children, who come to believe that their own convenience is what is best for their country. Bolívar was unable to pave the way for his dream, too early indeed, and the plutocracies took over the continent, entered into alliances with the empires, and the interest of the great majority of indigenous people, slaves and peasants was subordinated to the interests of the elites, who everywhere only proposed a precarious social stability, founded on the tense balance of injustice. Now let us not leave him in San Pedro Alejandrino, closing his eyes to the world for which he spent his years and his fortune, in whose greatness he thought until the last moment. A man like him continues to live in every moment of his days, he continues to live in his childhood and in his adolescence, in the cavalcades with Matea through the plains of the hacienda, in his meditations on the high seas going to Europe without sensing that he is traveling to find himself, still chatting with Miranda under the black skies of London, he goes on schooners and clippers fleeing from island to island, from failure to failure, constantly losing everything in the Acamari disaster. Winning everything again in the advance through the Orinoco, seducing Rebecca, Anita the French, Nicolasa, Fanny, Louisa, Isabel, Jeanette, Josefina, Manuela, dreaming of the beautiful Bernardina under the big ceiba trees of Cartago or Cali, he keeps swimming down the Orinoco with his hands tied, trying to jump on a horse, over and over again, from blow to blow, until he succeeded. Keep dancing all holy night if the couple is good, he keeps thinking about peas, getting mad at PR, hating a bando. Thinking about the letters to Santander, reading French verses to Peru by Lacroix from his hammock, he continues fighting sword in hand through an alley in Madrid and on a beach in Cumana, risking his body in battles, and continues to open jungle, climbing rocks, scrutinizing the fog, through Trujillo and Mompox, through Pativilxa, hear all the birds of the mountain, feel the flight of tropical vampires pass by, and he rocks in his hammock and thinks about his campaigns. It is entering the free cities, he continues in Junin directing the combat, the charge of the spears, the onslaught of the spears that weave the scarlet battle, without knowing that he is writing some verses by Borges. He continues to get angry with setbacks and betrayals, still on the run from death in Jamaica, keep thinking, pen in hand, under the shadow of large beetles, while the butterflies of the night burn in the lamps, he thinks again of the gondolas that cross the radiant canals. While his body coughs down the Magdalena before a bank of hungry alligators, continues drafting the Constitution of Bolivia, he is still locked up in Guayaquil deciding with San Martin the fate of America. So we can leave it anywhere, at any time in your life, and also in the future. We can leave it now on any street in our convulsed present, leave it wondering if it was worth the effort. But no, he wouldn't wonder that. I would read the newspapers, I would look at those screens that never shut up, I would try to see what we are up to. He never stood still, and he had no vocation for being a statue. He will start walking down one of these streets, in Port-au-Prince or in Lima, in Trujillo or Havana, in Cali or Caracas. There is always everything to do. The story begins every day. He is no longer a soldier or a politician, he is a common man, a citizen. The challenge now is another, and big. And he leaves wondering only one thing, where to start again. Finish. In Search of Bolivar. William Ospina.